It was a romance fueled by passion and secrecy. He was a smooth operator with a shady history.
A smooth guy who could say all the right things.
She, a beautiful singer with an angelic voice.
She sang with such grace and passion.
And a soft spot for bad boys.
She didn't want her family to know.
But their affair was cut short when one of them vanished into thin air.
This case was just twisted beyond belief.
Is this a crime of passion or the work of a cold-blooded criminal?
I think he is a sociopath.
He may not have shown his true cards to her, and when she found out, he dealt a big joker, and it was a violent one.
My brother just came to my house and told me that he killed his girlfriend.
Wednesday, June 16th, 2004, 7:25 p.m. It's a humid evening in Spartanburg, South Carolina. On the south side of town, two police officers pull up to an unassuming home in a quiet neighborhood. They're investigating a missing persons report filed by a woman who's been trying to get a hold of her niece for weeks.
Her aunt called in and wanted to perform a welfare check. And when police arrived, they end up forcing entry into the residence.
When officers set foot inside the home, a powerful stench overwhelms them. In the bedroom, they make a horrifying discovery.
There were dogs that had been there that obviously was pregnant and had puppies, and one has been there for probably a couple of weeks. They became malnourished and some of them even died.
It's just a terrible scene to walk into.
When detectives saw the state of the house, that's when they started to take this case very seriously because they knew that nobody would leave their house or their pet in that state.
170 to dispatch.
But the officers can find no sign of the missing woman, dead or alive. The only thing investigators know for certain is the homeowner's name, Tamika Houston. Raised in South Carolina, Tamika Houston was eager to grab life by the reins.
Tamika was a cute, petite, 4'11", 125-pound dynamo. She had a very outgoing personality. She had a beautiful smile. Full of life, full of life. She loved children, she loved animals. She was just a real people person.
You talk to family members and friends. They said she's one of the nicest people you can meet.
Tamika was also a church-going girl and never missed Sunday service.
Tamika was religious, and she tried to live by the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Tamika was also the star of the church choir.
She had a very unique sound, and it was a beautiful voice. She sang with such grace and passion.
She loved to sing. Her voice, just her size, 4'11", she had a strong voice. Very strong voice.
Though it wasn't just her kind heart and heavenly voice that attracted people to Tamika.
She was beautiful on the inside, on the outside. She was just always so sweet and friendly.
Friends and family believed Tamika's talent and good looks had her destined for stardom.
Tamika was trying to find herself. She just hadn't really figured out which direction she wanted to go in life professionally. And I think that she was hoping that maybe singing would be something that would lead her to the life she wanted.
As much as Tamika longed to be a professional singer, she was hesitant to leave Spartanburg in order to fulfill that dream. That's because in the summer of 2000, Tamika fell for a handsome bad boy, the rough, tough, and extremely charming Terrance Moss.
I was at my family's convenience store. I came out of the store and I was going to get on my motorcycle, and then she popped up and she said, "Do you have an extra helmet?" We went riding and we exchanged numbers and we started a relationship. Ever since that day. He had a very large, outgoing personality. He's a bit of a character. Sometimes the way to a woman's heart is, if you can make her laugh, you can get in there. I think Terrance made his way into Tamika's heart with giggles and laughs.
Terrance and Tamika's love connection was intense from the get-go.
In the beginning of a relationship, there's always a honeymoon period. And everybody's on their best behavior. There's a lot of positive energy.
It was instant soulmate. Just the love that we shared between each other, you would have thought that we were married. We complemented each other very well.
That positive energy carried over into the bedroom.
Terrance and Tamika pretty much did what young people in their 20s do when they're dating. I think for Terrance, when he hooked up with Tamika, he had kind of gotten a little gem. He gets this beautiful, exotic woman.
She had a big heart and such a small body. That was a great attraction for me.
The sexual chemistry between Tamika and Terrance was undeniable. But apparently, some of Tamika's friends worried Terrance was trouble.
Terrance had previous involvement with law enforcement and with district attorney's offices, which is more commonly known as a record.
Tamika was willing to overlook Terrance's checkered past, but she feared her family might pressure her to break off the relationship if they ever found out about his criminal record.
So what do you got planned for today?
Nothing really.
Not really? Nothing?
I don't know that Tamika's family knew a whole lot about Terrance and Tamika's relationship because she wasn't really introducing him to all of her friends and family.
But keeping their romance on the down low proved difficult once Terrance moved in with Tamika and her trusty pit bull, Macy.
Well, I'm gonna go out with Gail and Jenny after work, okay? You go out with your friends tonight?
Yeah.
You don't have anything planned during the daytime?
No, I'm probably just gonna catch up on some sleep, honestly.
Terrance didn't work a lot. I think that led to some strain in the relationship. Tamika had to get up and go to work every day, pay the bills. There may not have been as much contribution from Terrance.
Terrance's behavior ultimately caused Tamika to question his fidelity.
When people start to not trust their partners, that can lead couples into a very unhealthy dynamic.
Where the hell you been?
The situation came to a head one night in 2004.
Every night you out, I'm so sick and tired of this
And Tamika's rage sent Terrance over the edge.
Why are you yelling at me?
An altercation between Terrance and Tamika, and it got ugly.
She was ready to fight. And I snapped back and I punched her.
I'm not dealing with you, you stupid.
Dealing with what? Look, I run this you remember that.
The incident prompted Tamika to press charges and Terrance to move out of the house. But making a clean break from Terrance would prove more difficult than Tamika ever imagined. Especially once Terrance moved into an apartment just a few miles away. But as investigators survey the scene inside Tamika's home, they can't help but wonder, has Tamika skipped town of her own free will? Or has something more sinister transpired? The search for answers will lead investigators into a sordid web of lies, deceit, and the ultimate betrayal. When she met Terrance Moss, 20-year-old Tamika Houston thought she'd found the man of her dreams.
I'm not gonna do this anymore, Terrance.
But Terrance and Tamika's storybook romance had turned out to have a not-so-happy ending.
It was a tumultuous relationship. It was not all smooth sailing.
But Tamika's relationship woes paled in comparison to the horrific discovery police made inside her home in June 2004.
The house was in a state of disrepair. A dog had allegedly eaten one of the puppies.
Something she treasured and loved very much was dead. It goes from this is unusual to this is probably foul play.
Officer, what do you got?
Moments later, detectives are on the scene. Their first notion is that there's been a home invasion.
Any signs of forced entry?
No signs of forced entry. When we did our search, we did find the purse, though.
Her purse was still in the house, her driver's license, things that a woman normally takes with her when she's leaving home, all of that was still there.
Is that her cell phone? That phone was with the purse.
Have you had a chance to take a look at it?
No, I had not.
That feeling starts to creep in that something's happened to Tamika. And we hope to God it's not the worst case scenario.
Confusing matters even more is that Tamika's car is nowhere to be found. Was it another clue to this case? Or could Tamika have left town intentionally to start a new life elsewhere?
If things weren't panning out like she expected, she could have easily decided to try to just get a new start, and she just left.
I'm gonna take a look around.
Yeah.
But why would Tamika leave town without telling anyone?
In this particular case, police are trying to start an investigation 2 weeks after the fact. Lots of leads grow cold, witnesses forget things, so that definitely creates a problem.
Hoping to unravel this mystery, detectives reach out to family and friends. Most of them have no idea where Tamika might be.
Do you know what happened?
Not exactly. That's what we're here trying to figure out.
But one friend tells police that a few weeks earlier, Tamika came to see her.
I do like red.
It's fun. Gives a little bit of pizzazz to it.
While she was there, she received a call.
Give me about 10 minutes. Okay, I'll be there. All right.
When Tamika hung up, she told her friend she had to run.
What's that about?
Something good.
A few minutes later, a car pulled up outside.
Tamika got in, she waved goodbye to her friend, and they drove off.
She get a look at him?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't think to look.
Investigators can't help but wonder if the driver of that car was Tamika's ex, Terrance Moss.
Boyfriends and husbands are persons of interest a high amount of the time because they are the perpetrator a disproportionately high amount of time.
Jealousy and anger can lead people to commit violence against one another. It's led to murders, disappearances, and definitely assaults.
The notion that Terrance might be responsible for Tamika's disappearance gains even more traction when investigators research the domestic assault charges Tamika filed against Terrance. Turns out they were set to square up in court in a matter of days.
You have a girlfriend and a boyfriend that's having a domestic dispute, so quite naturally the boyfriend is always the number one suspect.
On June 23rd, detectives bring Terrance down to the station for questioning.
You know Tamika Houston?
Yeah, I know Tamika.
When's the last time you saw her?
A couple weeks ago.
Terrance claims he's been distant from Tamika since she decided to press charges against him.
What happened a couple of weeks ago?
We had an argument.
An argument. Okay. When was the last time you saw Tamika Houston?
I already told you a couple weeks ago.
And that's it?
Yes.
And he adamantly said, I did nothing to harm this woman. I loved her. I didn't do anything, and I don't know where she is.
Police have their doubts. They grilled Terrance about the pending domestic violence charges.
We just got into a fight.
Did you hit her?
Yeah.
And the coincidental timing of Tamika's disappearance.
They had some domestic violence issues in the past, but he insisted that he was innocent.
With little cause to hold him, detectives tell Terrance he's free to go.
If you're lying to us, we're going to yank you back in here.
Meanwhile, CSIs process Tamika's house, searching for any physical evidence that might tie Terrance to her disappearance.
Investigators are looking for any evidence of her disappearance or murder. They would search the residence for blood stains, hair, or any other forensics information.
When the police searched, they were unable to find any information connecting Terrance to Tamika's disappearance.
But soon, a shocking phone call will lead detectives to the shores of a nearby lake and lead Tamika's friends and family to fear the worst.
As cold-blooded as you can get.
Okay, what is your name? Can't tell you that, ma'am.
It's been almost 10 days since Tamika Houston was reported missing. Investigators have discovered that her ex-boyfriend, Terrance Moss, allegedly assaulted her and was due in court the same week Tamika went missing.
That was one of those things that had the police seriously intrigued as to could he have enough motive for her to be gone.
But Terrance is adamant he had nothing to do with Tamika's disappearance. And CSIs can find zero physical evidence linking him to any crime.
There's not really any hard evidence. We can't find where she's gone. Can't find where maybe a crime scene had been located. You don't have any signs of forced entry. There's no forensics evidence. So that doesn't give an investigator a whole lot to go on.
Whenever an adult goes missing, there's always speculation that maybe that person had a secret life. Maybe that person broke character and just departed from everything that they had been and just ran off.
She was a person that loved to just up and leave, but something was different about this time.
If Tamika had tried to put some miles between her and Terrance, she'd need money to do so. Investigators subpoena her credit cards and bank statements, but that only deepens the mystery.
Tamika had last used her debit card 2 days before she was last seen. There was no activity after that date.
Things weren't adding up to a free will vanishing. There was something wrong here, and there was probably something seriously wrong.
Fearing the worst, detectives begin checking local hospitals for any Jane Does that have recently been admitted. They also look to see if there are any 911 calls that could be related to Tamika's disappearance.
This is what I called you guys about.
In doing so, they make a discovery that stops them cold.
Spartanburg 911. My brother just came to my house, and he told me he killed his girlfriend and put her in Cleveland Park Lake.
Where does your brother live?
He stayed at the Barksdale.
Cleveland Park is located just a few miles from Tamika's home, as are the Barksdale apartments. But those aren't the only details that give investigators a pause.
He said he drowned her because something about he got drunk and she'd been cheating on him.
Okay, what is your name?
I can't tell you that, ma'am, because the police will pick me up.
Is it possible ex-boyfriend Terrance killed Tamika in a jealous rage and then dumped her body in Cleveland Park Lake?
I believe police were looking at Terrance as a possible suspect because there were so many similarities.
Given this startling new information, detectives execute a search of the area around Cleveland Park Lake.
Police officers dispatched cadaver dogs. They checked the shoreline. They even had rescue divers to go down and see if they could recover any bodies in the lake.
They searched the lake several times and they found nothing.
Then it also puts the department back to ground zero, not to mention it also leaves the family members and friends still in limbo.
Through it all, Terrance Moss maintains he isn't responsible for his ex-lover's mysterious disappearance.
Let them do what they wanted to do. Didn't find anything. I had nothing to hide. Told them thank you, and y'all wasting a lot of time.
Terrance loved Tamika unconditionally.
Still, more than a few people have their doubts about the veracity of Terrance's statement.
It would make sense that Terrance might be involved. They had had a rocky relationship, and sometimes love can make you do crazy things.
With the investigation at a stalemate, Tamika's family decides to take matters into their own hands. They post flyers around town, offering a reward for any information about Tamika.
I've checked woods, I've checked abandoned houses, I've checked lakes, I've checked dumpsters, I've checked landfills. I've been everywhere looking for my daughter.
The flyers trigger a flood of tips. Most are dead ends. But one caller claims to have recently spotted someone matching Tamika's description.
That tip raised hopes that Tamika was still alive and just a missing person.
We really appreciate you taking the time to come in.
No problem, no problem.
Investigators sit down with the man who called in the tip and slide him a photo of Tamika.
Well, this is our girl here. I'd like to take a look at her.
After police interviewed the man that said he saw a woman matching Tamika's description around town, he said it looked like one of his co-workers.
When I saw the flyer, I just thought, for sure.
But that's not her.
I know a girl looks just like her, but her name's not Tamika.
The tip ended up being a dead end.
With the clock ticking, investigators are beginning to lose hope of ever finding Tamika.
The longer the period is, the less chance of finding evidence or clues. It deteriorates or something may destroy it, or if there's foul play, then the individuals involved may clean up or remove the evidence.
But soon a new tip will come rolling in, and a single turn of a key will Tamika Houston thought she'd found true love when she met Terrance Moss. But after a tumultuous relationship ending in a violent confrontation, Tamika filed assault charges against Terrance. Shortly after that, she vanished without a trace. And investigators are struggling to understand what happened.
There's not really any hard evidence. We can't find where she's gone. We can't find where maybe a crime scene had been located.
But investigators are much closer to finding Tamika than they realize. Police dispatchers receive a complaint about an abandoned car at the Barksdale apartment complex near Cleveland Park Lake, the same lake police had searched earlier.
The windows were rolled down. It looked like the car had been parked there several weeks because it had been weathered.
Investigators head over to the Barksdale, where they find an abandoned Honda Civic.
I got here, ran the license plate. It comes back to Tamika Houston.
Our missing girl.
That's her.
An abandoned vehicle turns out to match Tamika's car. You wonder if she was abducted, if the person may have dumped the car there. Investigators combed the vehicle. They did not find any kind of evidence of foul play or blood or gunpowder or anything.
They did, however, find a set of car keys that did not go to Tamika's car in the console.
There were 2 keys that went to a car. Those keys fit Fords made between the 1950s and 1980s. And then there were a couple other keys that looked like they went more to your standard residential type door locks.
Detectives tried the keys in every door at the Barksdale apartment complex to no avail. They also interviewed several residents who provide conflicting accounts.
While police were conducting the canvass of the apartment complex, they found an individual that saw 2 African-American men abandon the car in the parking lot.
But a second resident reports seeing a single African-American male park the vehicle there a while back. Investigators can't help but wonder if this was the work of their prime suspect, Terrance Moss. Or could someone else have possibly targeted Tamika Houston?
They were looking for anything that might lead them to clues on Tamika's disappearance.
Looking for answers, investigators turn once again to Tamika's friends and family. Speaking to her father, they begin to learn more about Tamika's volatile relationship with her ex-lover, Terrance Moss. Turns out, Tamika wasn't the only woman in Terrance's life.
He was married before he had even started dating Tamika.
According to Tamika's father, Terrance's wife wasn't happy about his relationship with Tamika, and one day she decided to pay her a visit.
This random woman shows up to Tamika's house. Turns out, she's his wife, Jennifer Moss.
Could Jennifer Moss have been so angry about her husband's relationship with Tamika that she murdered her in order to put an end to the affair?
Jennifer Moss allegedly confronted Tamika and said, "I'm going to kill you." She saw Tamika as some kind of threat.
He did have children with his wife. Terrance's children used to spend a lot of time with Tamika, which made Jennifer very angry.
For police, it's a stunning turn of events. They couldn't help but wonder if Jennifer had made good on her threats. But Terrance isn't so sure.
There were so many rumors, untruths, things that people just made up, things that people just pulled out of the sky.
Investigators decide it's time to get some answers. Wasting no time, they track down Jennifer and press her about her alleged threats and Tamika's disappearance.
Did you ever confront her, threaten to kill her?
Absolutely not. No.
Jennifer, did you have anything to do with her disappearance?
No, I did not.
Her and Tamika never had any encounter. That was all just gossip and rumors.
According to Jennifer, after learning he'd shacked up with Tamika, she'd filed for divorce. What's more, she claimed their problems involved much more than infidelity.
He was very violent. He had a temper.
Jennifer and I, had disputes and arguments. She may have had some bad things to say because our marriage ended bad.
According to Jennifer, Terrance simply wasn't worth the effort of attacking Tamika.
When the police talked to Jennifer, my ex-wife, they found that she was not a person of interest. As far as her and Tamika goes, no run-ins with each other, no exchanges, that's totally fabricated.
Given the allegations of abuse, coupled with the discovery of Tamika's car, investigators bring Terrance Moss in for another round of questioning. Terrance steadfastly maintains he had nothing to do with Tamika's disappearance.
I was just screaming on the inside. I was like, why won't y'all listen to me? Why won't y'all listen to me?
He was adamant about loving Tamika and adamant that he brought no harm to this girl.
Detectives tossed the keys they recovered from Tamika's car in front of Terrance.
Recognize those?
No. Should I?
They're your keys.
No, I've never seen those before.
In order to verify Terrance's claim, detectives head to his apartment.
They tried this key in every single door, and the keys did not fit.
Once again, detectives are unable to tie Terrance to Tamika's disappearance.
Terrance kept saying to me, I ain't no killer. I ain't no killer. I'm a guy who laughs and jokes around. Yes, I love the ladies, but no, I'm no killer.
He was just an innocent guy who got caught up in a bad situation and was wrongfully accused of something.
Having reached a dead end in their investigation, detectives decide to retrace their steps. They start again with the keys they found in Tamika's car.
They start going to the different local locksmiths to see if any of them may identify or recognize the key and can maybe give them some other kind of lead of where it would go to.
Finally, a small hardware store recognized the key.
Due to a marking that he put on his keys, he's able to look up in his logbooks.
Looked at that key and said, that key goes to the Fremont School Apartments.
It was an old school house that had recently been turned into apartments. I believe there were over 40 apartments.
Hey, how you doing?
Oh,
You the apartment manager?
I'm the apartment manager. Nice to meet you. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Detectives immediately head to the Fremont School Apartments and begin the painstaking process of inserting the key into each of the complex's 47 doors.
The investigators secured the area as they went and checked the doors to try to see if they could find the door that the key would work for.
Hours into the search, and investigators have tried 46 locks. None of them are a match.
Almost coming to the end of it, they actually kind of give up hope.
Find anything?
No, didn't fit any of those either.
But when investigators get to the 47th and final door, something miraculous happens.
We got it. This is it.
Just like a scene out of a movie, the key fit into the very last door of the building.
What they find on the other side will lead investigators to the darkness on the edge of town and the brutal truth. It's now been more than 5 months since 24-year-old Tamika Houston vanished. After running down a slew of dead-end leads, investigators have made a startling discovery. A mysterious key found in Tamika's abandoned car is a match to a door in the Fremont School Apartments.
This is a big break in the case. Police will now try to find out who owns this apartment.
But the apartment is completely empty.
Clear. There was nobody in the apartment when the police got there.
It's empty.
Was this apartment leased?
Without a warrant, investigators can't formally search the place. They ask the landlord to pull the rental history on apartment 47.
This unit is vacant right now.
Who used to live here?
A Chris Hampton.
Investigators are taken aback. They've never heard of anyone named Chris Hampton throughout their extensive investigation.
The fact that there was a Christopher Hampton that did live in an apartment at that particular time throws another person of interest into the case at this point.
Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to post an officer here at the door, come back with a search warrant and forensics, and really do a thorough search.
Okay.
Detectives run a background check and quickly discover Chris Hampton is no stranger to law enforcement.
Chris Hampton was someone I would characterize as a thug.
He was a thief, a quiet thief, not a sneaky thief.
When the police actually went searching for this guy named Chris that everyone was talking about, he was in jail.
If Chris Hampton was in jail at the time Tamika went missing, then it's unlikely he had anything to do with her disappearance. However, a closer examination of Chris's records reveal he's only been in jail about 5 months, which means he was a free man at the time Tamika disappeared. So what exactly is his connection to Tamika?
Tamika's family did not know about Chris Hampton. A lot of her, family and friends didn't know about Chris Hampton.
But one of Tamika's close friends reveals that she and Chris had recently started dating.
Tamika may have went with Chris thinking that he could give her the safe haven to get away from Terrance, and he would be able to protect her and take care of her.
Police also learned Tamika had met Chris at the end of April 2004, when she and a friend attended his birthday party. From the moment they laid eyes on each other, they had an instant connection. Detectives decide it's time to talk to Chris Hampton.
Mr. Hampton, we need to speak to you about Tamika Houston.
What do y'all want to know?
What was your relationship with her?
Chris explains the relationship in one word.
Sex. It was sex.
Nothing else.
Nothing else.
Chris Hampton was a smooth operator. He could present himself to Tamika Houston as this suave, smooth guy who could say all the right things. And yet, the other Chris Hampton that he may not have shown her was a criminal.
It appears Tamika kept the true nature of her budding relationship with Chris a secret from friends and family.
Usually, family members know, your friends know, maybe even the aunt in Florida should have known. But the first time police heard about Chris Hampton's and Tamika Houston's relationship was from him.
When's the last time you saw her?
Investigators asked Chris if he had anything to do with Tamika's disappearance. Chris Chris tells them he last saw Tamika on May 27, 2004, 18 days before she disappeared.
She came over, she asked me for some money, and that was it.
And you're gonna stick with that's the last time you saw her?
Yeah.
Why were your keys in her car?
Like I said, she came over, she asked me for some money, and that was it. It's the last time I saw her.
To investigators, Chris's claims seem suspicious. On January 10, 2005, they obtain a warrant to search Chris Hampton's apartment at the Fremont School Complex. A forensic team combs the place. It's not long before they uncover a curious bit of evidence.
They find a bleach stain, and to the naked eye, it just looks like a bleach stain on carpet.
When CSIs darken the room and spray the chemical luminol, they make a ghastly discovery.
It was found that this apartment was covered in blood.
That had been cleaned up, obviously. But they went and checked the floorboard and found blood in the subflooring of the apartment.
CSIs collect samples and compare them to DNA collected from Tamika's apartment.
It found that the blood was Tamika's blood. That would definitely move Mr. Hampton to the front of the line as far as suspects go.
But a suspect in what exactly? Detectives still don't know if Tamika is alive or dead.
The blood evidence found at Chris Hampton's apartment would not have been out of place. If she'd spent any time around him and they were in a relationship, it's quite possible that the blood could have gotten there in another way.
The blood evidence is enough to bring formal charges against Chris Hampton.
Based off the evidence, they had enough probable cause to have him arrested.
With charges pending, investigators question Chris again.
They confronted him with the evidence they had, obviously the blood that was found in his apartment.
You want to tell us the truth?
That's when Chris Hampton does a surprising about-face.
I know what happened.
I guess the guilt had ate him up, and he decided to come clean. He admitted that he had actually been the one that killed Tamika.
We got into a fight. It got heated. And I hit her.
Tell us exactly how it happened.
Hello.
According to Chris, it all began on the afternoon of May 27, 2004.
Just give me about 10 minutes and I'll be out there. Okay.
After talking to Tamika on the phone, Chris picked her up at her friend's house. And they returned to his apartment, where Chris claims the two then had sex. Later that evening, while Chris was ironing a shirt, Tamika asked to borrow some money.
Baby, can I borrow $200?
You know, I'm gonna pretend like you didn't say that. That's what I'm gonna do. Pretend like you didn't say that at all.
Like I didn't.
His version is she was asking for money. He made it clear to Tamika he didn't have any money to give to her.
You dare ask me for money when you know I got kids, I got things to take care of?
He was going to provide for a child he had with another woman.
How do you keep putting your kids and me in
How
one?
dare you tell me that? Listen, this ain't love. This is not a relationship. Stay out of my business. Don't ask me for no money.
You know, you were such a sorry excuse of a man.
And in a flash of anger, he struck her with an iron.
She fell to the ground and I knew she was dead.
I'm not sure how one accidentally hit someone with the iron. I think it takes a lot of violent tendencies in order to think about throwing an iron at someone, particularly someone's head.
Why didn't you call an ambulance, somebody to come and try and help her?
I thought it was too late.
Had he done what you're supposed to do in an instance like that, taken her to the emergency room, number one, she may very well be alive, but he didn't. He put her in a closet, then he tried to clean up the crime scene.
After Tamika spent several hours hidden in his closet, Chris says he wrapped her body in a carpet, drove to some woods not far from Cleveland Park Lake, where he buried Tamika's body in a shallow makeshift grave.
It's also shocking that he could just murder her and dump her in a gravesite like common trash. That disturbs me.
I think that Chris just snapped because he was angry with Tamika.
The guilt got to him, and I think it ate him up basically at that point, and he panics.
That evening, Chris Hampton leads investigators to the spot where he claims to have buried Tamika Houston.
For whatever reason, marked the grave with some twigs that he made into a cross.
A team from the coroner's office sets about the grim task of unearthing the body.
They want to make sure they get every piece of evidence they can. They find every bone they possibly can in that crime scene. Unfortunately, they could not find her head, where he had told them that he had went back to her body and had really dug it up. He originally thought that he was going to turn himself in, but decided not to. He had took her head and actually put it in a trash bin, and it was not found.
His actions are just so vile that it's hard to even wrap your brain around why somebody would do those kinds of things.
CSIs do find a piece of jawbone, which they cross-reference with Tamika's dental records.
There were dental records that were consistent with Tamika's, but there was also jewelry that was consistent with Tamika's.
Her family was holding on to hope. It was painful for them to hear that Tamika's body was found.
Knowing what happened to her, knowing that she was so disrespected even after she was gone, I think that has to be a very hurtful emotion for a family to experience.
Chris Hampton is booked on charges of murder. He maintains Tamika's death was an accident.
It's going to be hard for him to sell that he didn't mean to kill her. His actions were loud words. Because his actions showed that he murdered her, meant for her never to be found, and probably would not have been found if it wasn't for finding out the keys and finding out the DNA in the apartment.
He went into a rage and killed me. That's what I feel in my heart.
But with no eyewitnesses to counter Chris's assertions, searching for answers in the Tamika Houston case, detectives have finally uncovered the truth. It seems that in an effort to protect herself from her allegedly abusive ex-boyfriend, Terrance Moss, Tamika found herself in the arms of a lover with an even more violent streak. Career criminal, Chris Hampton.
Tamika, obviously from the pattern that we're starting to see, had an interest in bad boys. And unfortunately, which led her to this violent individual.
You're trying to make me a priority.
Oh, a priority? He may not have shown his true cards to her. And when she found out, he dealt the big joker. And it was a violent one.
Chris Hampton maintains Tamika's death was an accident. Prosecutors find Chris's claim dubious, but with no other eyewitnesses to refute his story, a murder conviction is by no means a slam dunk.
It was not necessarily murder. It could have been manslaughter. It could have been self-defense. It could have been an accident.
On April 3rd, 2006, the trial begins. Chris Hampton is led into Spartanburg Circuit Court in shackles. If convicted, Chris could face 30 years to life in prison. But before opening statements begin, Chris Hampton makes a surprise announcement.
He admitted that he killed Tamika Houston with malice aforethought.
He got angry. He meant to kill her, and he basically had an evil heart.
Chris didn't really see a way out and felt like it didn't matter. He was going to be punished for it anyway.
Fearful for his life, Chris begs the court for leniency, but the judge shows little mercy.
This particular judge listened to the facts, and he concluded that life without parole was the proper sentence. He will be in prison until he dies.
Even as Chris Hampton is carted off to prison, those closest to Tamika can't help but lament the bizarre chain of events that led to her murder.
I would just want to be able to sit and look him in his eyes, in his face.
The weight of an ancient betrayal does not simply fade with the passing of decades. It solidifies in the dark, gathering a terrifying kinetic force until a single, calculated confession tears through the fabric of a peaceful community, like an artillery shell. You are listening to the structural collapse of an absolute illusion, a psychological reckoning where the very man who swore a solemn oath to protect the vulnerable steps out of the light to reveal himself as the architect of their destruction. For 32 long, silent years, the file lay frozen in the deepest subbasement of the county archives, cataloged as a permanent monument to systemic failure, an unmapped enigma that the residents of Oak Ridge tried to bury beneath manicured lawns, high school football games, and the desperate pretense of suburban paradise. But when a highly decorated, 72-year-old retired police captain walks into the state attorney general's headquarters on a freezing winter morning, his voice steady as he logs a precise serial number that has not been spoken aloud since 1994. It does not merely reopen a cold case. It shatters the collective sanity of an entire generation, proving that the monster they had been running from wasn't a transient ghost drifting along the highway corridor, but the absolute master of the local precinct, a man who wore a badge by day and hunted his own community by night. Go back to the rain-drenched autumn of 1994, a specific cultural flashpoint when the valley town of Oak Ridge operated on a baseline of total, unquestioned insularity, a geography where front doors remained unlocked through the humid harvest weeks, where keys were left resting in the ignitions of family station wagons, and where the presence of an unfamiliar face on the perimeter of the public park was enough to trigger an immediate, protective mobilization of the neighborhood watch network. That absolute innocence was executed with freezing, surgical finality over the course of a single October weekend when a young college student vanished from her off-campus apartment without leaving behind a single audible scream, a single drop of blood, or a single traditional forensic footprint. The primary scene was a masterpiece of cold, clinical containment, no signs of forced entry at the windows, no structural disruption of the living area, and only a single, jarring anomaly left resting on the kitchen counter, a neatly folded police issue incident report card, marking the precise microsecond where a routine civilian life was violently intercepted by a predator who moved with the absolute authority of the state, vanishing into the midnight fog before the concept of an alarm could even be conceived by her roommates. The early investigation was a chaotic, fundamentally broken scramble led by a localized department that was completely incapable of processing a technical abduction that left no physical trail. They established massive, high-visibility roadblocks across the state transit lines, dragged the black waters of the lower reservoir, and processed hundreds of transient industrial laborers, but every investigative trajectory dissolved into an impenetrable wall of absolute, mocking silence. The frustration soon turned inward, transforming the quiet suburbs into a toxic landscape of deep mutual suspicion where oldest friends stopped greeting each other across property lines, where families reinforced their perimeter gates with heavy steel chains, and where every quiet bachelor within a 50-mile radius was evaluated through a permanent lens of defensive hostility. The case file grew bloated with every passing season, filled to capacity with anonymous tips that led to dead ends and erratic witness sketches that matched no one on the regional registries, until the task force was quietly dissolved due to political pressure and systemic exhaustion, leaving behind a cold case that sat in the dark like an unexploded bomb, a permanent indictment of the law's inability to protect its own children. For over 3 decades, the town of Oak Ridge lived inside the heavy shadow of this unresolved horror, building its modern identity on top of a subterranean layer of calcified collective trauma. The family of the victim remained trapped in a perpetual loop of static grief, maintaining her apartment bedroom exactly as it had been on that October evening, a silent shrine of textbooks, vintage cassettes, and family photographs frozen in 1994, serving as a daily accusation against the detectives who had dropped the ball. The original officers eventually carried their personal failures to the local graveyard, while a younger generation of law enforcement looked at the dusty cardboard boxes in the record room with a mixture of academic detachment and total futility. The story of the missing girl passed into the realm of local folklore, a dark cautionary tale whispered to keep children from wandering too close to the unlit edges of the valley woods, a cultural myth that stripped away her specific humanity and replaced her with a generic, faceless phantom who had long since evaporated into the historical ether. Then, the psychological armor of the predator cracked from within, proving that the conscience of a killer, when locked inside the decaying prison of an aging body, can become a far more devastating investigative tool than any modern forensic platform. It did not happen because of a sudden database match or a new technological breakthrough. It happened because Arthur Pendleton, facing a terminal medical prognosis that gave him less than 6 months of lucidity, realized that the flawless public reputation he had spent his life constructing was completely worthless against the terrifying reality of his own history. He walked through the front doors of the state capitol's Central Bureau, his hands steady as he placed his retired service weapon and a faded, hand-drawn map on the reception counter, demanding an immediate audience with the chief of the homicide division. When the recording equipment in the secure interview room hummed to life, the detectives did not hear the frantic rambling of a dying lunatic. They listened to a cold, linear, and utterly meticulous confession that detailed the exact layout of the victim's home, the precise radio codes used to divert local patrols away from Elm Street on the night of the crime, and the coordinates of a shallow grave hidden deep within the restricted perimeter of a state police training reserve. The execution of the search warrant at his immaculate, suburban residence on the edge of the valley was a surreal collision between the clinical precision of modern tactical units and the total breakdown of a neighborhood's reality. The state police vehicles arrived without sirens, blocking off the ends of the quiet cul-de-sac with unmarked SUVs, moving up the concrete steps while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains in paralyzed disbelief. The man who had lived at number 12 was a legend in the regional law enforcement community, a retired captain who had spent 30 years directing the county's major crimes unit, a public figure who had stood before the television cameras in 1994 to promise the family of the victim that his detectives would never stop searching for the truth. He had utilized the absolute respectability of his uniform to construct a permanent defensive buffer, a shield of civic decorations, charity leadership roles, and commendations that kept the eyes of suspicion permanently averted from his own front door while he maintained the material wreckage of his crimes less than 50 feet from his precinct office. The forensic excavation of the Pendleton property turned the neat suburban lawn into a multi-layered historical graveyard, a space where 3 decades of a monstrous double life were systematically dug out of the earth itself. Behind a false concrete retaining wall in the crawlspace beneath his personal workshop, agents uncovered a locked, military-grade ammunition container that functioned as a dark historical archive. Inside lay the victim's missing college identification cards, her personal diaries from the autumn of 1994, and a collection of official, unredacted internal police files detailing the day-to-day operations of the original task force. He had not just run away from his crime. He had hoarded it, lived with it, feeding his own narcissistic pride on the community's ongoing despair from a distance of just a few blocks. The realization hit the modern investigative team like a physical blow. The monster hadn't escaped to a foreign country. He had stayed right here, directing the investigation, comforting the family at public memorials, and using his absolute authority as a trusted supervisor to monitor and neutralize the police department's progress in real time. The behavioral analysis interviews conducted in the weeks following the arrest revealed a psychological profile that was deeply unsettling in its total lack of traditional madness. The retired captain discussed the mechanics of the abduction with the cold, analytical objectivity of a contractor describing a structural installation, showing no remorse, no sorrow, and no recognition of the human cost of his actions. He explained how he had selected the target by tracking her patterns during his routine patrol shifts, exploiting the town's absolute trust in his uniform to execute the crime without ever creating a single anomaly in his official duty logs. He viewed his 3 decades of absolute freedom not as a flight from justice, but as a magnificent intellectual victory over a system he considered fundamentally primitive and blind, a daily calculation of risk that he managed with absolute discipline until his failing health finally made the secret too heavy to carry into the grave. The reaction of the Oak Ridge community to these disclosures was a secondary wave of trauma that tore through the remaining social fabric of the town like a localized explosion. The realization that the man who had sat at their dinner tables, mentored their children, and held the keys to their public safety was the very predator who had hollowed out their community in 1994 induced a profound state of collective paranoia. People began to reevaluate every interaction, every conversation, and every neighborhood watch meeting they had ever attended with Pendleton over a 30-year period, searching for the hidden malice behind his gentle, authoritative smiles. The trust that had been slowly rebuilt over generations was instantly vaporized, replaced by a deep, systemic cynicism, a feeling that safety is a fragile social illusion and that the person wearing the badge or watering their lawn next door might be carrying a darkness that defies all human comprehension. The legal teams managing the prosecution are constructing an omnibus offensive that treats the suspect's respectability not as a mitigating factor, but as the primary weapon used to facilitate capital murder and evade detection. They are assembling an evidentiary presentation that links the physical artifacts from the crawl space, the detailed confession tapes, and the modern digital reconstructions of the 1994 crime scene into a single, unbreakable chain of intent. The state is avoiding the traditional, slow-paced methodology of the analog era. They are building a high-contrast digital narrative designed to survive the highest levels of appellate review, ensuring that every single hour of the killer's 32-year campaign of deception is recorded into the permanent legal history of the state as an act of absolute, premeditated cruelty. The momentum of the voiceover hits a dawn dap, rhythmic peak as the formal indictment is read in the county courthouse, an event that transforms the quiet valley town into the epicenter of a national media storm. The satellite trucks line the perimeter of the square, their glowing masts reaching into the dark summer sky, while true crime analysts shout into microphones, trying to condense 32 years of horror, respectability, and a sudden confession into a 30-second news block. Inside the courtroom, the silence is thick, heavy, and absolute as the prosecutor reads the contents of the confession tapes into the record, the cold, clinical words of the retired captain echoing off the high ceilings like a voice from the grave. The defendant sits at the table in his maximum security orange uniform, his face a static mask of total resignation, standing exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a truth that waited 32 long years to finally, irrevocably, claim its absolute and final due. The formal registration of Arthur Pendleton's confession inside the state attorney general's central processing matrix did not signal a swift, therapeutic conclusion for the community of Oak Ridge. Instead, it initiated a cold, deeply destabilizing excavation of the town's collective administrative history. To understand the dawn dap, highly rhythmic progression of this post-confession reality, you must move past the broadcast media vans parked outside the courthouse and look directly into the technical logs of the Internal Affairs Division tasked with processing the suspect's 40-year career. For over 3 decades, the town had operated under the comfortable, protective myth that the 1994 disappearance was the work of an external phantom, a rogue anomaly who had drifted off the state highway, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and vanished back into the vast American landscape. The shocking revelation that the killer was actually a permanent anchor of their local justice system, a man who possessed the absolute authority to sign arrest warrants, manage evidence vaults, and direct the day-to-day operations of the patrol divisions, dismantled the very concept of institutional trust that the residents relied on to survive. The physical focus of the state's forensic extraction shifted instantly from the suburban bungalow on Elm Street to the historical evidence lockers located beneath the old precinct house on Main Street. When the joint state-federal audit teams crossed the perimeter of the storage facility, they didn't find the chaotic, disorganized accumulation of a traditional municipal archive. They were confronted by an environment that had been arranged with the clinical, unyielding precision of an institutional records vault. Every cardboard box, every plastic evidence bag, and every typed incident log from the autumn of 1994 had been organized by file number and date under Pendleton's direct supervision during his final tenure as captain of the Major Crimes Division. But a system cannot alter its own internal metadata. Utilizing high-resolution optical scanning arrays, the digital forensics team began converting decades of handwritten internal logbooks into searchable text fields, searching for the precise administrative discrepancies that the suspect had used to erase his own footprint. The technical data logs from the audit quickly identified a localized density of file modifications concentrated within the 3 weeks following the October 1994 abduction. The sound of high-speed servers processing old digital database backups soon filled the quiet investigative war room, a steady, mechanical hum that systematically transformed the historical narrative of the case into a clear, mathematical blueprint of obstruction. As the old system layers were restored by data specialists, the audit team uncovered the physical mechanism of the captain's absolute immunity, a series of deleted dispatch entries, altered license plate recognition logs, and deliberately misclassified witness reports that had been routed through Pendleton's private terminal codes. He had treated the primary investigation as an exercise in internal asset management, utilizing his rank to quietly redirect field detectives away from the transit corridors he used to transport the victim, ensuring that his own operational footprint remained completely invisible to the men who called him chief. The reaction of the surviving members of the 1994 task force to these disclosures was a secondary wave of structural trauma that tore through the retired law enforcement community like a localized explosion. These men, veteran field detectives who had spent their careers carrying the weight of an unresolved tragedy, believing they had simply lacked the forensic tools to solve the case, were suddenly forced to confront the terrifying reality that their failure had been engineered from the top. They found themselves looking back at old crime scene photographs, remembering the late-night strategy meetings in the precinct briefing room, and realizing with a cold, paralyzing sickness that the man standing at the chalkboard, directing their search grids and evaluating their leads, was the very predator who had buried the evidence. Every late-night coffee shared with Captain Pendleton, every words of encouragement he offered during the darkest weeks of the investigation, and every press conference they stood behind him for was now retroactively transformed into a grotesque display of narcissistic manipulation. The voiceover takes on a more Dawn-Dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal structural analysis of the county clerk's historical archives, which are undergoing a comprehensive exhumation by the state attorney general's office. The realization that a prime suspect had maintained control over the primary evidence files for over 20 years exposed a massive, systemic vulnerability in the way the predigital legal network processed and preserved its data fields. Analysts reviewing the manual ledger books discovered that the suspect's name had actually been raised by a junior patrol officer who noted Captain Pendleton's personal vehicle parked near the off-campus apartment complex during the midnight hours of that October weekend. However, the report had been systematically purged from the master files within 48 hours of its entry, marked as a clerical error by a supervisor's administrative override code. This digital erasure, preserved only in the unallocated space of an old backup tape for over 3 decades, was the loophole that allowed the monster to maintain his station, secure his promotions, and retire with a full pension while the family of the victim spent 32 years waiting for an answer. Meanwhile, inside the state crime laboratory, the physical analysis of the artifacts recovered from the ammunition container reached its final, definitive stage. The technicians were no longer merely looking for biological material. They were utilizing advanced nuclear resonance imaging to analyze the microscopic structural wear patterns on the metallic surfaces of the victim's recovered college identification cards and personal jewelry tokens. The data showed that the suspect didn't just bury these items in the dark to forget them. He handled them with a specific, regular frequency, pulling them out of the sealed container during the exact dates that corresponded with the anniversaries of his crimes. The forensic timeline turned the metal box into a living psychological document, an extension of his obsession that he used to sustain his narcissistic focus during the long, quiet decades of his retirement. He was a man who lived a dual existence in the most literal sense, maintaining a flawless, polite exterior for his neighbors while keeping his internal clock permanently locked in the cold, industrial dark of his past. The behavioral analysis interviews conducted with Pendleton's former colleagues and professional peers revealed the terrifying effectiveness of his social performance. These individuals don't describe a man who is odd, distant, or difficult to work with. They remember an exceptional citizen who was always the first to volunteer for the difficult tasks, the man who helped clear snow from the driveways of the elderly, the person who organized the community watch programs in the late 1990s. He was so thoroughly, aggressively decent that he created a psychological blind spot in the minds of everyone around him. If an early investigator had ever suggested in 1995 that the grandfather from Elm Street matched the physical description of the phantom seen near the fields, the suggestion would have been dismissed as an absurdity, an insult to a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the protection of the community's children. This absolute mastery of the social contract is what makes his profile so deeply unsettling to the modern legal system. It suggests that respectability is not a barrier to evil, but the ultimate mechanism for its concealment. The legal teams managing the prosecution are constructing an evidentiary presentation that bypasses the traditional, emotional appeals of the analog era, choosing instead to build a Dawn-Dap, high-contrast digital narrative that functions with the cold, unyielding precision of an algorithm. Every piece of data pulled from the hidden server, the surveillance logs, the automated risk analyses, the high-resolution images of the stolen school items, will be presented to the jury as a series of deliberate, administrative decisions made by a corporate executive managing a business enterprise. The prosecution is avoiding the trap of treating the suspect as a traditional madman. They are framing him as a white-collar criminal whose currency happened to be human lives, a meticulous bureaucrat who utilized his intelligence and his structural position within the state to manufacture an absolute immunity that lasted for 35 long, silent years. The voiceover hits a Don Dap, highly cinematic peak as the wet, freezing summer of 2026 reaches its conclusion, bringing with it a series of low-pressure storm systems that plunge the valley town of Oak Ridge into a permanent, iron-gray twilight. The heavy rain pours over the concrete plaza of the county courthouse, the stone steps slick and reflective under the flashing emergency strobes of the transport vehicles waiting in the security tunnel. Inside his maximum security isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits on the edge of the low metal bunk, his hands clasped tightly behind his knees, his eyes fixed on the mechanical, rhythmic sweeping of the surveillance camera mounted above the steel door. He has been stripped of his names, his titles, his respectability, and his camouflage. He is no longer the captain who guided the safety of a town, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the woods. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological entity trapped inside a technological panopticon that will not stop until the final legal judgment is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to finally, truly, take its first real breath in 35 long, agonizing years. The transition from this administrative isolation into the deep psychological profiling of the suspect's final decade of freedom reveals just how narrow the margin of his survival truly was. As the cyberforensics units reconstruct the web traffic logs from his home router dating from 2020 to 2025, they discover that the killer was experiencing a profound, low-frequency panic as the state's genealogical databases began to expand across consumer platforms. He wasn't tracking the local police anymore. He was obsessively monitoring the public terms of service updates for companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. He understood with perfect, mathematical clarity that the flawless analog camouflage he had spent his life constructing was completely useless against a world where a distant third cousin could upload a saliva sample and inadvertently convert his entire family tree into a forensic beacon. His late-night searches show a man who knew the net was closing, a predator who spent his final years of retirement sitting on his porch, watching the delivery trucks and the utility vans pass his house, wondering if the next knock at the door would be the administrative error that finally ended his 35-year run. The voiceover maintains its Don Dap, rhythmic cadence as we focus on the physical demolition of the suspect's workshop, an event that has turned the residential lot into an open-air public theater of historical reckoning. The City Council's emergency demolition order is being executed by heavy crews who have surrounded the structure with high-contrast environmental containment shields. They aren't just tearing down a building, they are treating the structure as an industrial hazard, systematically crushing the concrete, the timber, and the brick foundations into a uniform, sterile aggregate that will be buried in an unlisted state landfill 3 counties away. The neighbors stand behind the security perimeter in total, paralyzed silence, the steady roar of the diesel excavators and the crunch of breaking brick forming the acoustic backdrop to the final erasure of the lie they lived beside for nearly half a lifetime. They are watching the physical scenery of their memories being ground into dust, a mechanical purification project that is necessary to reclaim the very air of the neighborhood from the lingering presence of the monster who managed their safety. The deconstruction of the mechanical and financial framework that insulated the Oak Ridge killer for over 3 decades leads directly into the most tightly guarded, high-contrast arena of the modern state prosecution team, the systematic cross-referencing of his psychological profile with the digital behavior logs recovered from his Elm Street residence. To understand the Don Dap, highly rhythmic progression of this technical exhumation, one must leave the sensory chaos of the media crews outside and look directly into the high-contrast data screens of the Joint State-Federal Behavioral Analytics Command Post. For nearly 4 decades, the public narrative surrounding the 1994 cold case focused exclusively on the geography of the valley fields, treating the lack of a physical trail as an environmental obstacle that human intuition simply couldn't overcome. However, the data extracted from the suspect's personal computer systems in the summer of 2026 reveals a far more chilling reality. He did not survive by vanishing into the margins of society. He survived by monitoring the psychological evolution of the town itself, converting the community's ongoing trauma into a clinical feedback loop that he used to verify the integrity of his own camouflage. The analytical core of this data-driven prosecution strategy relies on the absolute recovery of a hidden partition found within a commercial network storage array disguised as a routine household backup drive in the suspect's workshop. When the cyberforensics specialists initiated a deep sector analysis of the drive's master file table, they didn't just find standard personal files or financial spreadsheets. They uncovered a meticulously indexed local database titled Oak Ridge Community Assessments, which the suspect had maintained with the cold, administrative precision of a civil actuary from 1998 to 2025. Pendleton had established a series of automated web scraping scripts that monitored every regional message board, local news comment section, and citizen-led investigative forum dedicated to the memory of the missing girl. Every time a resident posted a retrospective reflection on the anniversary of the disappearance, or an amateur sleuth offered a new hypothesis regarding the vehicle tracks seen near the fields, Pendleton's system would instantly capture the data, filter it for keywords related to newly developed forensic technologies, and store the file into his private security directory. He was a digital voyeur to the ongoing, intergenerational grief of the very community that celebrated him as a local hero, sitting in his comfortable leather recliner, sipping coffee, and analyzing the town's unresolved trauma with the cold, detached eye of a systems engineer measuring a design tolerance. He treated the emotional devastation of the victim's family as a structural barometer. As long as the public discourse remained focused on the mythical Phantom of the Fields, or a generic, traveling drifter who had long since left the state, he knew his domestic persona was mathematically secure. The realization that their decades of agonizing uncertainty were being systematically recorded, tracked, and used as a security metric by the man who lived just a few streets away has induced a profound state of collective paralysis across the modern Oak Ridge populace, converting their historical sorrow into a burning, silent rage that refuses to be pacified by a simple courtroom confession. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal administrative deconstruction of the suspect's active role within the local civic associations during the peak years of the case's stagnation. Joint Task Force agents reviewing the physical minutes of the Oak Ridge Neighborhood Watch program from 1995 to 2005 discovered that the suspect didn't just participate in the meetings. He volunteered to manage the organization's regional communication logs. He was the person responsible for drafting the security circulars distributed to local households, the man who met regularly with the precinct's community liaison officers to discuss suspicious activity reports, and the citizen who advocated for the installation of early, analog surveillance systems in the public parks. This structural positioning provided him with an extraordinary, high-level defensive buffer. He had access to the exact security concerns of his neighbors, allowing him to observe the police department's local investigative priorities from the inside, ensuring that his own daily routines remained entirely consistent with the behavioral baseline of a model community protector. The technical core of the state's multi-layered indictment has converted the second floor of the county courthouse into an interactive, digital laboratory of war. State crime analysts have plotted Pendleton's confirmed employment timelines, municipal consulting projects, and civic volunteer records against a secondary, hidden layer of unclassified historical missing persons files from neighboring counties. The correlation is a precise, mathematical overlap that illuminates the monitors with terrifying consistency. Whenever the regional civic associations hosted a cross-county seminar on local safety or emergency preparedness, the jurisdictions hosting the events experienced a sharp, undocumented variance in transit security anomalies within a specific 72-hour window. The prosecutor's office is preparing an expansive federal omnibus brief that treats his multi-decade history of public service not as a character reference, but as a state-funded logistical platform, a series of deliberate scouting expeditions that allowed him to analyze the systemic vulnerabilities of rural law enforcement networks before executing his crimes with absolute premeditated finality. Meanwhile, inside the State Forensic Laboratory's high-technology division, the extraction teams are concluding their analysis of the physical items recovered from the steel container found beneath the workshop floor. The primary focus of the engineering team is not the textbooks or the school bag, but the precise chemical profiles embedded in the leather-bound ledger, where the suspect recorded his surveillance operations. Utilizing advanced mass spectrometry and high-resolution optical scanners, the technicians have isolated microtraces of industrial lubricants, agricultural chemicals, and localized pollen varieties trapped within the binding glue and paper fibers for over 30 years. The data stream is an ironclad, environmental blueprint that matches perfectly with the specific soil and chemical composition of the deep drainage canals that border the eastern perimeter of the Oak Ridge Agricultural Zone in 1994, providing a tactile, mathematical chain of physical evidence that permanently destroys the defense's ability to challenge the accuracy of his verbal confession or suggest that the statement was coerced by the interrogation team. The behavioral analysis interviews conducted with Pendleton's former associates and professional peers provide a deeply disturbing look into the absolute lack of emotional friction within his mind. These individuals do not describe a man who showed signs of strain, distance, or erratic behavior during the long decades of his flight. They remember a patient, methodical administrator who was always the first to arrive at a community cleanup event, the neighbor who kept spare keys for half the houses on the street, and the trusted grandfather who could be relied on to watch over the neighborhood children during summer holidays. He had trained his mind to compartmentalize his reality so perfectly that he could step out of his dark archive beneath the floorboards and immediately adopt the emotional frequency of an empathetic protector. This absolute mastery of the social contract is what makes his profile a terrifying case study for the modern justice system. It proves that respectability is not the absence of darkness, but the most sophisticated mechanism available for its defense, an administrative shield that kept the eyes of justice blind until the integrated technology of a new century finally broke the code. The legal teams managing the prosecution are constructing an evidentiary presentation that completely bypasses the slow, emotional pacing of traditional analog trials, choosing instead to build a Don-Dap, high-contrast digital narrative that moves with the cold precision of an algorithm. Every data point pulled from his hidden server, the surveillance scrapers, the neighborhood watch logs, the cryptographic keys, and the chemical metadata of the hoarded tokens, will be presented to the jury as a series of corporate decisions made by an operations manager directing an enterprise. The state is avoiding the tactical trap of treating Pendleton as a generic madman. They are framing him as a cold-blooded white-collar criminal whose primary product happened to be human lives, a meticulous bureaucrat who used his intelligence and his structural position within the community to manufacture a 35-year immunity that has finally, irrevocably, run out of time. The voiceover hits a Don-Dap, highly cinematic peak as the wet, freezing spring of 2026 transitions into a dark, stormy summer, bringing with it a series of low-pressure weather fronts that parallel the exact atmospheric conditions of that fateful September night in 1994. The heavy rain pours over the concrete towers of the county holding facility, the wind rattling the reinforced perimeter fences along the secure transport lane. Inside his isolation cell, the killer sits on the edge of the low metal cot, his wrists secured to the heavy leather transport belt around his waist, his eyes locked on the mechanical movement of the cell's automated air filtration system. He is a man who spent half a lifetime operating as the absolute master of his environment, utilizing his intelligence, his professional status, and his digital camouflage to dictate the reality of an entire town. But inside this clinical, unyielding machine, his complexity has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the fields. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological anomaly trapped inside a technological panopticon that will not stop until his real history is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to face the long, cold, and devastating light of a truth that will never let them look at a neighbor the same way again. The structural deconstruction of the Oak Ridge killer's defensive perimeter shifts now from his home network to the high-stakes, high-definition battleground of the State Judicial Assembly, where the formal filing of the omnibus indictment has triggered a massive, administrative confrontation over the viability of historical evidence. To understand the Dawn Dap, highly rhythmic acceleration of this legal conflict, you must look past the sensationalized digital broadcasts on the evening news and step into the sterile, neon-lit war room of the state prosecutor's cyberforensics division. For 35 years, the absolute separation between the grandfatherly neighbor on Elm Street and the active capital predator was protected by the systemic fragmentation of the pre-digital legal network. But in the summer of 2026, the state is no longer relying on the fragile, fluctuating memories of aging witnesses or the manual paperwork of a dissolved task force. They are deploying an algorithmically driven, multi-layered evidentiary strategy that converts the suspect's own meticulous lifestyle, his civic calendars, and his counter-surveillance data into an inescapable, unyielding architectural trap. The physical focus of this new legal offensive centers on the absolute authentication of the metadata embedded within the Oak Ridge Community Assessments database recovered from the hidden workshop server. When the cybercrime investigators initiated their deep packet extraction protocols on the seized hard drives, they didn't just find copies of public news articles. They uncovered the precise digital keys that proved the suspect had spent decades actively managing his risk profile against the systemic advancement of forensic science. The data logs reveal that whenever the state crime laboratory announced a technical upgrade, such as the transition to more sensitive DNA sequencing platforms or the implementation of centralized ballistic indexing systems, the suspect's automated scripts would instantly log the update, cross-reference it with the structural components of the 1994 crime file, and execute a security audit of his own property. He was a corporate risk manager whose sole liability was his own hidden history of capital murder, utilizing the tools of the modern information age to maintain the structural integrity of his 35-year camouflage. This level of calculated vigilance has completely transformed the prosecution's narrative for the upcoming trial, allowing them to bypass the traditional, slow-paced emotional appeals of the analog era and build a Dawn Dap, high-contrast presentation that functions with the cold, mechanical precision of an algorithm. The state's legal team has constructed a massive, three-dimensional temporal matrix that maps the suspect's civic engagements, neighborhood watch duties, and banking history against the exact timeline of the state's historical cold case investigations. When the analytical software executes the correlation script, the monitors illuminate with a devastating, uninterrupted pattern of active counter-surveillance. The prosecutor's office is preparing to present this data to the jury not as evidence of simple curiosity, but as a continuous, 35-year act of obstruction, a deliberate, systematic campaign to use his status as a model citizen to monitor, manipulate, and neutralize the reach of traditional justice. The voiceover takes on a more Dawn Dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the secure vault of the state medical examiner's office, where a specialized team of forensic anthropologists and metallurgical experts are concluding their analysis of the physical artifacts recovered from the crawlspace ammunition box. The stainless steel examination tables are lined with the material wreckage of a stolen life. The victim's leather school bag, her water-damaged textbooks, and the small, personal tokens that the suspect had preserved beneath his workshop floor for over 3 decades. The primary focus of the forensic team is not the text within the books, but the microscopic trace evidence trapped within the fibers of the leather and the metal hinges of the container itself. Utilizing high-intensity mass spectrometry and nuclear resonance imaging, the technicians have isolated unique chemical signatures, microscopic traces of specialized agricultural fertilizers, industrial block grease, and localized river basin pollen variants that match perfectly with the environmental profile of the Oak Ridge industrial perimeter as it existed in the third week of October 1994. This environmental metadata forms an ironclad, physical chain of continuity that effectively eliminates the defense team's ability to challenge the validity of the suspect's recorded confession. The chemical data proves that the container was not a recent fabrication, nor was it a collection of items compiled from secondary sources. It was a static, environmental capsule that had been sealed in the immediate aftermath of the crime, absorbing the precise, localized chemical footprint of the abduction scene before being buried in the dark beneath the workshop foundation. The forensic technicians move with a quiet, reverent precision, uploading the data streams directly into the state's central judicial network, converting the physical fragments of a 35-year-old tragedy into permanent, unalterable metadata fields that will remain completely resistant to procedural manipulation or the slow, degrading movement of human memory. Meanwhile, within the legal offices managing the defense of the 70-year-old killer, the reality of this technological net has induced a state of total, systemic panic. The defense attorneys, veteran litigators who spent their careers navigating the procedural loopholes of the manual era, find themselves completely unequipped to counter an evidentiary matrix that updates in real time on the prosecutor's monitors. They have launched a series of desperate omnibus motions designed to suppress the contents of the local server and the container, arguing that the initial search warrants were overly broad, that the digital extraction techniques violated their clients' constitutional protections against unlawful data seizure, and that the physical evidence could have been contaminated by environmental leakage over 35 years. But their procedural objections are systematically crumbling against the technical chain of custody established by the state's cyberanalysts, who have embedded unique cryptographic hash values into every stage of the data recovery process, proving with mathematical certainty that the archive is an untainted, uncompromised record authored exclusively by the suspect himself. The internal state of the Oak Ridge community during this pre-trial phase is characterized by a deep, structural isolation that is redefining the daily life of the suburbs. The neighborhood of Elm Street, once a symbol of open lawns and intergenerational trust, has been transformed into a silent, watchful arena of defensive surveillance. Homeowners are no longer relying on simple door locks. They are installing commercial-grade security grids, motion-activated floodlights, and high-resolution camera networks that saturate the asphalt with harsh white light from dusk until dawn. People look at their oldest friends through a lens of permanent suspicion, wondering what secondary secrets are still buried beneath the foundations of the neat, tree-lined street. The open, casual social contract that had defined the town for a century has completely evaporated, replaced by a defensive social architecture that treats every polite smile, every shared tool, and every casual greeting as a potential layer of deception. The behavioral analysis interviews conducted within the high-security medical wing of the county jail provide a deeply disturbing look into the absolute lack of psychological friction within the killer's mind. Pendleton does not speak with the frantic, disjointed rhetoric of a typical cinematic lunatic. His voice remains low, steady, and measured, carrying the precise, professional cadence of an operations manager discussing a corporate supply chain. When the interrogators press him on the logistics of his multi-week surveillance of the victim's home in 1994, he discusses his methods for tracking her family's vehicle movements and mapping the local police patrol schedules with a flat, chilling objectivity that turns the stomach of every detective in the room. He shows no anger, no remorse, and no recognition of the human cost of his actions. He views his 35 years of freedom as an extraordinary achievement of personal discipline, a lifelong intellectual victory over a system he considers primitive, slow, and blind. The legal strategy of the state prosecution team has evolved into an omnibus offensive that treats the suspect's respectability not as a character reference, but as the primary weapon used to facilitate capital murder and evade detection. They are preparing an interactive, digital presentation for the upcoming trial that integrates the chemical metadata, the counter-surveillance logs, and the financial tracking fields into a single, unbreakable narrative of intent. The state is avoiding the tactical trap of presenting Pendleton as a generic madman. They are framing him as a cold-blooded white-collar criminal whose currency happened to be human lives, a meticulous bureaucrat who used his intelligence and his structural position within the community to manufacture a 35-year immunity that has finally, irrevocably, run out of time. The voiceover hits a Don Dapp, highly cinematic peak as the wet, freezing spring of 2026 transitions into a dark, stormy summer, bringing with it a series of violent low-pressure fronts that parallel the exact atmospheric conditions of that fateful September night in 1994. The heavy rain pours over the concrete columns of the county courthouse, the stone plaza slick and reflective under the flashing blue and red strobes of the maximum security transport vans waiting in the security tunnel. Inside his isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits in absolute silence, his ankles chained to the floorboards, his frail wrists locked in a heavy leather transport belt that constricts his movement. He is a man who spent 40 years operating as the absolute master of his environment, using his intelligence, his professional status, and his digital camouflage to dictate the reality of an entire town. But inside this clinical, technological machine, his complexity has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the fields. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological anomaly trapped inside a technological panopticon that will not stop until his real history is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to finally, truly, take its first real breath in 35 long, agonizing years. The legal confrontation within the county courthouse intensifies to an unprecedented degree as the state's forensic accounting unit systematically dismantles the parallel economic network that sustained Arthur Pendleton's absolute insulation for 35 consecutive years. To understand the Dawn-Dap, highly rhythmic acceleration of this financial exhumation, one must step completely away from the public viewing gallery and look directly into the high-contrast data streams of the Joint State-Federal Asset Forfeiture Command Post. For nearly 4 decades, the absolute barrier between the suspect's modest, transparent household budget and the covert logistics required to execute and conceal a capital crime was maintained by a cash-heavy shadow economy that Pendleton managed with the clinical precision of an institutional compliance officer. He did not survive by hiding his resources in offshore shell banks or complex international real estate trusts. He survived by weaponizing the primitive, unmonitored analog cash networks of the late 20th century, creating a financial cloaking device that remained entirely invisible to traditional auditing protocols until the integrated banking networks of 2026 pulled his historical paper trail into the light. The analytical core of the state's financial indictment relies on the comprehensive recovery of a secondary set of financial ledger records linked to a long-dissolved commercial entity labeled Pendleton Logistics and Asset Management, a fraudulent sole proprietorship established in a neighboring jurisdiction in the spring of 1995. When the cyber-forensic accountants executed a digital search warrant on the centralized archival servers of a regional Midwestern banking cooperative, they uncovered a multi-decade history of small, highly regular cash deposits that were completely unrecorded in his official public tax filings. Pendleton had utilized his position as an independent consultant for local manufacturing firms to solicit cash-only fees for private inventory audits, revenue streams that were never processed through automated merchant terminals. This unrecorded liquidity pool formed his operational resource baseline, a separate, untraceable fund that he used exclusively to finance the procurement of what his surveillance ledger termed disposable physical assets, the unremarkable, mid-tier consumer vehicles that he used to stalk the transit routes of the valley. The precise telemetry of these historical financial transactions provides the prosecution with an ironclad, behavioral blueprint that mirrors the exact timeline of the 1994 cold case and its subsequent administrative preservation. The forensic data shows that 48 hours prior to the abduction, Pendleton's shadow account experienced a localized cash withdrawal at an automated teller machine situated near a major regional transport hub. He didn't use personal credit facilities to purchase fuel, maintenance supplies, or temporary storage space during his active surveillance phases. He operated entirely within a self-contained cash ecosystem, leaving no digital footprint in the primitive commercial networks that began to emerge in the mid-1990s. This level of financial discipline required a relentless, daily vigilance that would drive an ordinary citizen to the point of psychological collapse. But to Pendleton, this discipline was a source of supreme narcissistic pride, a mathematical validation of his ability to outsmart a system he considered fundamentally primitive and slow. The voiceover takes on a more Dawn-Dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal structural analysis of Pendleton's workshop, which has been under total forensic siege by state excavation units for 21 consecutive days. The property has been stripped of its domestic utility, its tools hauled away to a secure warehouse, its inner walls cut away by technicians searching the hollow structural cavities for additional hidden physical tokens of his double life. Utilizing high-frequency ground-penetrating radar grids, the engineering teams identified a series of anomalous density patterns buried deep beneath the heavy concrete slab of the foundation, a structure Pendleton had poured himself in the winter of 1995. The sound of industrial diamond blade saws cutting through the reinforced concrete echoes across the quiet neighborhood of Elm Street, a loud, mechanical disruption that is systematically turning the site of neighborhood block parties into a raw, open-air historical graveyard. As the concrete sections are hoisted away by heavy machinery, the physical reality of Pendleton's dark archive is laid bare in the damp soil beneath the foundation. Investigators don't find the chaotic, scattered remains of an erratic offender. They discover a highly organized, subterranean storage vault constructed from heavy PVC conduit pipes, sealed at both ends with industrial-grade waterproof caps. Inside these airtight chambers rests the true depth of his multi-decade fixation, a massive collection of microcassette audio recordings that Pendleton had compiled during his volunteer management of the Neighborhood Watch communication logs. He had systematically recorded his interviews with local residents who were reporting suspicious activities, utilizing the raw data of their domestic anxieties, security vulnerabilities, and personal schedules to refine his own counter-surveillance protocols, using his position of public trust to harvest the security profiles of the very community that celebrated him as a local hero. The reaction of the surviving Oak Ridge community to these ongoing disclosures has induced a secondary wave of structural paralysis that is tearing through the remaining social fabric of the suburbs like an epidemic of pure, unadulterated paranoia. Parents who had trusted Pendleton to manage the security protocols of their blocks in the 1990s are rushing to the police precinct, demanding access to the recovered audio archives, forced to confront the terrifying possibility that their family's private security vulnerabilities were being used as an administrative metric by a serial predator. The local mental health infrastructure has collapsed under the volume of adult residents seeking emergency consultation to process the realization that the neighbor who had helped them secure their properties, who had sat in their kitchens, who had held their hands during times of community crisis, was the very monster who was systematically recording their fears to ensure his own absolute immunity. The legal strategy of the state prosecution team has evolved into an omnibus offensive that treats Pendleton's respectability not as a character trait, but as the primary weapon used to facilitate capital murder. They are preparing a multi-layered evidentiary matrix for the upcoming trial that links the physical evidence from the concrete vault, the microcassettes, the geological soil profiles from the crawlspace container, and the decrypted digital logs, into a single, unbreakable chain of intent. The prosecutor's office is not seeking a plea bargain. They are constructing an indictment designed to survive the highest levels of appellate review, ensuring that every single hour of the killer's 32-year campaign of deception is recorded into the permanent legal history of the state as an act of absolute, premeditated cruelty. The voiceover hits a Don Dapp, highly cinematic peak as the preliminary omnibus hearing date approaches, transforming the quiet streets of Oak Ridge into a high-contrast battleground of international media attention. The satellite trucks form an iron perimeter around the county square, their glowing masts slicing through the humid summer sky, while teams of true crime analysts shout into microphones, trying to condense 32 years of respectability, financial fraud, and subterranean forensic discoveries into a 30-second news block. Inside the holding cells beneath the courthouse, Arthur Pendleton sits in absolute isolation, his orange maximum security uniform hanging loosely from his frail, elderly frame, his wrists secured to a heavy leather transport belt. He is a man who spent half a lifetime operating as the absolute master of his environment, controlling every conversation, every data trail, and every human interaction to ensure his absolute survival. But inside this clinical, concrete machine, his control has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the fields. He is simply inmate number 77412, a prisoner of a truth that waited 32 long years to drag him out of the cold and into the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute judgment. The institutional fallout generated by the forensic extraction of Arthur Pendleton's subterranean financial and acoustic archive did not merely disrupt the administrative operations of the Oak Ridge Municipal Council. It catalyzed a profound, structural paradigm shift within the state's behavioral analysis networks and Department of Corrections. To understand the Don Dap, relentless momentum of this historical reckoning, you must look past the saturated digital broadcasts on the news networks and enter the sterile, neon-lit corridors of the state psychiatric facility's high-security evaluation wing. For 35 years, the absolute barrier between the empathetic, civic-minded neighbor and the predatory capital offender had been maintained by a psychological phenomenon so absolute, so meticulously managed, that it challenged the foundational theories of modern forensic psychology. In the summer of 2026, the state is no longer merely processing a criminal. They are conducting a systematic autopsy of an intellectual camouflage that successfully utilized the concept of community protection as an absolute shield against suspicion. The analytical core of the Behavioral Task Force's ongoing evaluation is focused entirely on the transcription logs of the clinical interviews conducted with Pendleton since the concrete vault beneath his workshop was opened. The interrogation room is an arena of quiet, high-contrast tension, where veteran federal profilers sit across from a 70-year-old man who refuses to adopt the defensive, stuttering posturing of a captured fugitive. Pendleton speaks with the precise, rhythmic cadence of an logistics expert delivering a lecture on institutional efficiency, discussing the dual architecture of his life with a chilling, narcissistic detachment. He does not minimize his crimes, nor does he express a single shard of human remorse. Instead, he frames his 35-year evasion of the justice system as a magnificent achievement of personal discipline, a multi-decade chess match where his ability to maintain an unblemished public reputation was the ultimate proof of his intellectual superiority over the community he exploited. The data streaming from the behavioral analysis matrices reveals that Pendleton's psychological compartmentalization was a structural choice, an active daily exercise that required an immense expenditure of cognitive energy. He explained to the profilers how he constructed an absolute firewall within his own memory, separating the somatic details of his 1994 crime from the domestic routines of his suburban life. When he walked through the front door of his brick ranch house after an operational expedition, he did not carry the emotional residue of the dark zones. He instantly adopted the persona of the doting father, the reliable neighborhood watch coordinator, and the trusted community mentor. He spent his evenings reviewing civic circulars, balancing the household ledger, and drafting security protocols for the local streets, using the sheer mundanity of his domestic existence to reinforce his own internal belief that he was entirely untouchable, a ghost who had successfully rewritten the rules of survival in an increasingly interconnected society. The voiceover takes on a more Don Dap, intense cadence as the narrative shifts to the administrative fallout within the regional judicial architecture, where the discovery of the microcassette neighborhood watch tapes has triggered a massive, multi-district class action legal offensive against the municipality. The realization that a local civic association had inadvertently provided a serial predator with an unmonitored platform to harvest the security profiles and daily habits of local households has completely destroyed the community's remaining institutional trust. Law firms representing hundreds of current and former Oak Ridge residents have filed massive omnibus lawsuits, demanding the immediate independent auditing of every municipal charter, civic file, and historical security report dating back to 1990. The town hall meetings, once quiet, bureaucratic procedures dedicated to budgetary allocations and infrastructure maintenance, have transformed into volatile arenas of public rage, where citizens are forced to confront the fact that their private domestic vulnerabilities were being systematically recorded and weaponized by the very man they trusted to watch over their properties. Meanwhile, within the State Forensic Laboratory, the Cybercrimes Unit is expanding its analysis of the metadata embedded in Pendleton's local workshop server. The technical data reveals that his counter-surveillance network was far more integrated into the local infrastructure than initially realized. Utilizing primitive administrative access codes that had been assigned to him during his tenure on a regional emergency coordination committee in the late 1990s, Pendleton had been quietly monitoring internal law enforcement communication frequencies for over 2 decades. He was able to review automated police dispatch logs, track the distribution of regional cold case resources, and read internal memos regarding county forensic archive upgrades without ever triggering a security alert. This structural breach allowed him to adapt his operational methodology in real time. The moment he learned that a neighboring county was upgrading its data sharing protocols, he adjusted his security practices, ensuring that his disposable assets remained completely hidden before they could be flagged by modern electronic systems. The physical reality of this technological betrayal has plunged the remaining residents of Elm Street into a state of permanent domestic militarization. The quiet neighborhood, once characterized by open lawns and a shared sense of Midwestern safety, has become an architectural monument to collective paranoia. Property owners are installing commercial-grade thermal imaging systems, reinforced steel security doors, and high-contrast perimeter lighting grids that flood the asphalt with harsh, white light from dusk until dawn. People look at their oldest neighbors through a lens of profound suspicion, wondering what secondary secrets are still buried beneath the foundations of the neat, tree-lined street. The sound of children playing outside has completely evaporated from the neighborhood. The cul-de-sac has become a silent, watchful space, an urban graveyard where the architecture of trust has been systematically dismantled by the memory of the man who lived at number 24. The legal teams preparing for the upcoming omnibus trial are facing an unprecedented challenge regarding the physical management of the evidence, which has grown to occupy two separate, climate-controlled storage facilities at the state capitol. The prosecution is constructing an evidentiary presentation that relies entirely on high-definition digital visualization models, converting Pendleton's surveillance journals, financial ledgers, and the chemical metadata of the hoarded jewelry tokens into a three-dimensional interactive timeline for the jury. They are avoiding the traditional, slow-paced methodology of the analog era. They are building a Don Dapp, high-impact narrative that functions with the relentless precision of a machine. Every slide, every data field, and every audio snippet from the recovered microcassettes will be presented as an interlocking component of a singular, multi-decade system of premeditated deception, leaving the defense with absolutely no room to manipulate the emotions of the courtroom or appeal to the advanced age and fragile medical condition of their client. The voiceover hits a Don Dapp, highly cinematic peak as the humid summer of 2026 transitions into a dark, stormy autumn, bringing with it a series of violent weather fronts that parallel the exact atmospheric conditions of the original 1994 crime. The heavy rain pours over the concrete towers of the state penitentiary, the wind rattling the reinforced security fencing along the perimeter walls. Inside his isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits on the edge of the low-metal bunk, his hands clasped tightly in front of his chest, his eyes locked on the mechanical movement of the cell's automated air filtration unit. He is a man who spent 35 years operating as the absolute master of his environment, utilizing his intelligence, his civic status, and his digital camouflage to dictate the reality of an entire community. But inside this clinical, unyielding matrix, his complexity has been entirely erased. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the fields. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological entity waiting for a mechanical legal process to write his real name into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the town of Oak Ridge to face the long, cold, and devastating dawn of a truth that will never let them look at a neighbor the same way again. The absolute disintegration of Arthur Pendleton's civic legacy did not merely freeze the administrative operations of the Oak Ridge municipal framework. It initiated an intense, cross-county exhumation of historical transit data and missing persons files that the state prosecution team now defines as the analytical peak of the entire investigation. To understand the Don Dapp, highly rhythmic momentum of this legal offensive, you must leave the public space of the courthouse plaza and look directly into the high-contrast digital mapping systems of the Regional Multi-Agency Task Force. For 35 years, the justice system had operated under the comfortable, localized assumption that the 1994 abduction was an isolated tragedy, a single, dark intersection of a vulnerable target and a traveling predator. But when the cyberforensic analysts began matching the timestamped metadata from Pendleton's decrypted counter-surveillance server with the manual, handwritten vehicle logs of regional industrial transport corridors, they uncovered a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional web of systemic calculation that shattered the boundaries of the original case file. The technical core of this expanded indictment centers on the algorithmic reconstruction of Pendleton's municipal consulting itineraries from 1993 to 2005. During these peak years of structural insulation, the suspect routinely volunteered to audit logistics frameworks and supply chain safety protocols for industrial distribution centers scattered along the tri-state transit network. He was not acting out of a desire for civic engagement. He was selecting his professional destinations based on a meticulous calculation of administrative latency. The recovered server data demonstrates that Pendleton had mapped the technical limitations of every rural sheriff's department within a 300-mile radius of the valley, identifying the precise jurisdictions that still relied on manual paper filing, isolated teletype networks, and non-computerized evidence vaults. He transformed his professional credentials into a high-level logistical reconnaissance mechanism, mapping the technological blind spots of the region before his tires ever touched the asphalt of a target zone. When the state data analysts executed an automated correlation script comparing Pendleton's confirmed travel expense vouchers with unclassified historical cold cases along the state highway paths, the monitors illuminated with a devastating, mathematically precise sequence of red anomaly markers. The pattern was regular, deliberate, and entirely free from statistical noise. Whenever the suspect spent a weekend auditing a transit warehouse in an adjacent county, the local missing persons registry in that specific jurisdiction would experience an immediate, unindexed variance within a narrow 72-hour window. He was utilizing the natural movement of commercial traffic to mask his active surveillance loops, operating in the transient, unmonitored spaces of truck stops, cargo hubs, and industrial perimeters where human presence is constantly shifting and individual identities are easily swallowed by the noise of the machinery. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal administrative deconstruction of the Oak Ridge Neighborhood Watch Network, which has become the epicenter of a massive, multi-district civil litigation battle against the local municipal government. The discovery that a serial predator had been permitted to manage the community's internal safety logs for over a decade has completely broken the remaining structural trust of the populace. Law firms representing over 400 households have filed comprehensive class action subpoenas, demanding the immediate digital extraction and forensic audit of every communication ledger, suspicious activity report, and meeting transcription preserved in the town hall archives since 1990. The local citizens are forced to confront the sickening reality that their historical reports of unidentifiable vehicles, broken perimeter gates, and dark hour movements were being routed directly through the desktop computer of the very monster who was organizing the response, allowing him to neutralize potential leads before they could ever reach the desk of a real detective. Meanwhile, inside the climate-controlled vaults of the State Forensic Laboratory, the engineering teams are finalizing their mass spectrometry analysis of the material fabric of the container recovered from beneath the workshop slab. The primary focus of this laboratory phase is the non-destructive scanning of the victim's leather school bag, an object that had remained sealed in the dark, anaerobic environment of the PVC pipe chambers for 35 years. Utilizing high-resolution infrared thermal imagers and nuclear magnetic resonance tracking, the forensic technicians have isolated distinct layers of environmental microtraces embedded within the deep grain of the leather. The data stream reveals a complex, multi-layered chemical itinerary. Particles of specialized zinc chromate primers used exclusively in industrial cargo containers, microscopic traces of high-density petroleum grease, and agricultural pollen variants native only to the eastern river basin. This environmental metadata forms a flawless, physical chain of custody that effectively paralyzes the defense team's procedural strategy. The chemical values prove that the physical artifacts were not gathered from secondary public sources or compiled years after the fact. They were environmental capsules that capture the exact, localized industrial footprint of the Oak Ridge perimeter as it existed during the third week of October 1994. The technical precision of this validation dissolves the 40-year gap between the suspect's respectable suburban retirement and the brutal reality of his historical crimes, converting the material fragments of a stolen life into permanent, unalterable digital metadata fields that cannot be cross-examined, manipulated, or dismissed by a sympathetic jury. The behavioral analysis interviews conducted within the isolation cell block of the State Maximum Security Unit provide an increasingly chilling portrait of the absolute psychological vacuum inside Pendleton's mind. The suspect does not exhibit the erratic, fragmented logic of a typical institutional inmate. He speaks with the low, measured, and hyperlogical cadence of a corporate safety director reviewing an operational efficiency manual. When pressed by federal profilers regarding the specific counter-surveillance protocols he implemented during the peak years of the investigation, he describes his methods for auditing his own data footprint with a flat, clinical objectivity that sends a wave of profound discomfort through the observation suite. He views his 35 years of undetected survival not as a matter of luck or administrative error, but as an absolute intellectual triumph over a society he considers fundamentally blind, disorganized, and slow. The reaction of the broader legal and law enforcement community to these disclosures has triggered a sweeping, multi-state administrative exhumation of historical records that is transforming the operational frameworks of cold case units nationwide. The Oak Ridge audit, the systematic, algorithmic cross-referencing of civic volunteer registries against unclassified transit crime files, is being implemented by federal executive mandate, turning the quiet, dusty record storage rooms of the Midwest into high-intensity data processing hubs. Teams of data analysts are working in rotating shifts to convert decades of manual ledger entries, typed carbon copies, and handwritten dispatch logs into searchable metadata fields, realizing with a cold, professional dread that the institutional respectability used to validate civic leaders in the late 20th century was the ultimate cloaking device for predators who possessed the discipline to become entirely, unforgettably normal. The legal teams managing the defense of the 70-year-old killer are experiencing a total, systemic collapse of their procedural timeline. The traditional tactics of delay, character mitigation, and the systematic erosion of witness credibility are completely useless against a prosecution narrative built entirely on immutable digital hashes and nuclear-grade environmental scanning. The defense has attempted to launch a high-volume series of omnibus motions to suppress the acoustic microcassettes and the web-scraping logs, arguing that the continuous tracking of public internet forums did not constitute an act of crime, and that the introduction of 40-year-old corporate records creates an unconstitutional prejudice in the minds of the populace. But their legal objections are systematically disintegrating against the ironclad chain of technical continuity established by the state's cybercrime attorneys, who have mapped the mechanical evolution of Pendleton's deception with a mathematical certainty that leaves absolutely no room for alternative, benign interpretations. The voiceover hits a Don Dap, highly cinematic peak as the stormy autumn of 2026 transitions into an exceptionally harsh, freezing winter, bringing with it a sequence of low-pressure Arctic fronts that plunge the valley town of Oak Ridge into an iron-gray, icy paralysis. The heavy freezing rain falls in continuous sheets over the county courthouse plaza, the stone steps slick and gleaming under the flashing blue and red strobes of the maximum security transport vehicles waiting in the subterranean security tunnel. Inside his isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits in absolute silence, his ankles secured to the floorboards, his frail wrists locked in the heavy leather transport belt that constricts his movement. He is a man who spent half a lifetime operating as the absolute master of his environment, utilizing his intelligence, his civic status, and his digital camouflage to dictate the reality of an entire town. But inside this clinical, unyielding matrix, his complexity has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the phantom of the watch. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological anomaly being processed by an unblinking digital panopticon that will not stop until his real history is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to finally, truly, take its first real breath of clean air. In 35 long, agonizing years. The focus of the joint federal-state investigation drops now from the public spaces of Oak Ridge's municipal courts straight into the deep, structural analysis of Arthur Pendleton's foundational years, tracking his movements back to the precise geographic regions he inhabited before arriving in the valley. When the cyberforensic units began parsing the structural layers of the compilation scripts found on his hidden workshop server, they didn't just find localized tracking algorithms from the late 1990s. They uncovered an extensive, digital trail of archived transit records, municipal tax logs, and real estate transactions that pulled the investigation back into the late 1970s, an era when Pendleton was completing his advanced graduate research in institutional management at a prominent Midwestern university. This archival exhumation shattered the defense's narrative that the 1994 crime was a sudden, spontaneous deviation in an otherwise unblemished life, exposing instead a multi-decade development phase where the suspect spent his youth studying the systemic weaknesses of human record-keeping networks. To understand the terrifying, mechanical precision of Pendleton's survival strategy, you have to look at the exact academic curriculum he mastered during his university years. He didn't focus on abstract theories of criminal psychology or standard sociology. He specialized in the structural analysis of municipal data infrastructure, publishing academic monographs that analyzed the information latency between localized rural law enforcement and centralized state repositories. He was studying how a paper document gets lost, how an administrative filing error can erase a statistical anomaly, and how easily a mobile individual can exploit the geographical boundaries between separate county jurisdictions. The modern task force is forced to confront a chilling reality. Pendleton didn't stumble into the administrative blind spots of the 20th century justice system by accident. He had systematically mapped those blind spots with the clinical detachment of a systems architect long before he ever selected his first physical target in the valley. This historical deep dive has completely rewired the state prosecution team's presentation for the upcoming trial, allowing them to construct an expansive, multi-state omnibus indictment that treats Pendleton's entire professional pedigree as a tool for evasion. Data analysts operating from the state capitol have integrated his early university housing applications, vehicle registration forms, and regional academic travelogues into a single, three-dimensional spatial temporal matrix that spans 44 years. When the software executes the cross-referencing algorithms against the National Archive of Unclassified Cold Cases from the late 1970s and early 1980s, the monitors illuminate with a devastating, high-density pattern of red clusters. The data reveals that the structural methods Pendleton used to insulate himself in Oak Ridge, the localized cash-only economy, the separate data partitions, the rigorous counter-surveillance routines, were already being deployed with absolute precision during his student years along the interstate transport routes. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal administrative chaos within the university's registrar office, which has been placed under a comprehensive federal preservation order. Joint Task Force agents, utilizing high-speed digital scanning arrays, are systematically exhuming decades of manual ledger entries, department payroll records, and student employment logs that had sat undisturbed in subterranean storage vaults for over 40 years. Investigators are uncovering old, handwritten evaluations from his faculty advisors, documents that described Pendleton as a student of exceptional focus, possessing a rare and remarkable capacity for objective structural analysis. The dark, stomach-turning irony is absolute in the quiet university halls. The very traits that made him an academic asset, his precision, his lack of emotional distortion, his meticulous attention to administrative detail, were the exact psychological components he required to manage a double life, without ever triggering a single behavioral red flag in the people who monitored his career. Meanwhile, inside the State Crime Laboratory's Cyberforensics Division, the technical extraction teams are parsing the oldest data blocks recovered from the workshop's local network drive. The digital archaeology reveals that during the early transition from manual, typewriter-based police logs to the National Crime Information Center's first automated databases in the mid-1990s, Pendleton was actively collecting system specifications, network routing guides, and data entry manuals. Operating through primitive dial-up terminal nodes from his home study, he was monitoring how the early law enforcement algorithms processed biographical data. He understood that the early systems were entirely dependent on exact, alphanumeric text matches, a limitation he weaponized by ensuring that his financial transactions, vehicle acquisitions, and out-of-county consulting itineraries utilized slight variations in punctuation, middle initials, or corporate abbreviations, rendering his parallel existence entirely invisible to the slow, fragmented data networks of the late 20th century. The physical exposure of this systematic, structural manipulation has plunged the broader manufacturing and industrial consulting sector into a sweeping compliance crisis that is redefining the concept of corporate background verification. The State Department of Professional Regulation has issued an immediate, emergency mandate ordering the comprehensive data exhumation, biometric re-verification, and historical profile audit of every independent safety inspector, inventory auditor, and supply chain consultant who received an operating credential prior to 2005. The project is an immense, bureaucratic mobilization that has transformed the quiet licensing offices of the Capitol into a high-intensity forensic laboratory, where teams of data specialists are manual cross-referencing thousands of historical commercial filings against the national database of unresolved transit abductions, realizing with a cold, professional dread that the very credentials used to grant Pendleton unmonitored access to regional distribution hubs were the ultimate camouflage for his operations. The legal teams managing the defense of the 70-year-old killer are experiencing a total, systemic collapse of their procedural strategy. The traditional defensive tactics of the analog era, delaying the trial until physical evidence degrades, challenging the memory of aging relatives, or appealing to the clean character record of a local grandfather, are completely useless against a prosecution strategy that relies exclusively on immutable metadata, cryptographic hashes, and nuclear-grade forensic imaging. The defense has attempted to file a high-volume series of desperate motions to suppress the historical university data and early commercial ledgers, arguing that the files are beyond the statute of limitations for administrative discovery, and that their introduction would create an unconstitutional, irreversible prejudice in the minds of the jury. But their procedural objections are systematically crumbling against the ironclad chain of continuity established by the state's digital analysts, who have mapped the mechanical development of Pendleton's deception with a mathematical precision that leaves absolutely no room for alternative, benign interpretations. The voiceover hits a Dawn Dap, highly cinematic peak as the freezing winter of 2026 continues to lock the state capitol in an iron sheet of ice, bringing with it a series of violent Arctic fronts that parallel the exact atmospheric tension of the unfolding historical exhumation. The heavy sleet rattles against the high windows of the county courthouse, the stone columns of the facade slick and gleaming under the flashing blue and red strobes of the maximum security transport vans waiting in the subterranean security tunnel. Inside his isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits in absolute silence, his ankles chained to the floorboards, his frail wrists locked in the heavy leather transport belt that constricts his movement. He is a man who spent 40 years operating as the absolute master of his environment, using his intelligence, his academic credentials, and his flawless social performance to dictate the reality of an entire town. But inside this clinical, technological machine, his complexity has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the neighbor, no longer the pillar of the community, and no longer the master of the watch. He is simply inmate number 77412, a biological anomaly being processed by an unblinking digital panopticon that will not stop until his real history is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to finally, truly, take its first real breath in 35 long, agonizing years. The deep cover operational timeline of Arthur Pendleton during the volatile first months of 1995 had been an exercise in absolute, calculated, and systemic camouflage, an era where the administrative shadow of his new existence began to stretch out across the interstate corridors. To understand how deeply the roots of this 35-year cold case penetrated the infrastructure of the region, you have to look past the frantic press releases issued by the Oak Ridge Police Department and look into the quiet, unrecorded movements of the suspect across state lines. In the immediate aftermath of the 1994 abduction, before the victim's case file had even gathered its first layer of dust in the basement archives, the local economy of Oak Ridge began to mutate under the influence of collective terror. Locksmiths became the most profitable tradesmen in the Valley County, their commercial vans parked outside every modest suburban home from sunrise to sunset, replacing simple brass latches with heavy, commercial-grade deadbolts. People stopped taking evening walks along the fields. The traditional, open ritual of greeting neighbors over garden fences was instantly replaced by the sudden, synchronized illumination of outdoor motion detector lights. The town was voluntarily entering a state of domestic siege, converting their homes into tiny, isolated fortresses because they could no longer shake the terrifying intuition that the predator wasn't a traveler passing through, but a permanent resident waiting for his next opportunity in the dark. The internal investigation within the Oak Ridge Police Department during this critical period was a masterclass in institutional desperation, a frantic attempt to salvage a public reputation that was rapidly dissolving under the weight of community anger. The initial failure to secure the industrial perimeter on the night of the crime had allowed critical physical evidence to be compromised by a shifting weather front, an administrative disaster that would haunt the department for over 3 decades. Detectives worked in rotating 12-hour shifts, their desks buried under a mountain of handwritten tips, anonymous letters, and erratic witness sketches provided by residents whose memories were already beginning to blur under the crushing influence of fear. They set up checkpoints on the state highway, stopping every vehicle that matched the vague description of an out-of-town car, demanding identification from thousands of innocent industrial laborers who were simply trying to make it to their morning shifts. The pressure from the mayor's office was unrelenting, a daily demand for a breakthrough that the physical reality of the scenes simply couldn't provide. It was a grinding, soul-crushing routine that eventually broke the health and morale of the original task force, leaving behind a legacy of bitter frustration that would be passed down to the next generation of officers like a generational curse. Meanwhile, just a few counties away, the killer was establishing the foundational layers of his parallel existence with the clinical precision of a deep-cover operative. He didn't just buy a house and settle down. He constructed a completely new psychological profile to match the respectable civilian identity he maintained on Elm Street. He didn't choose a career that would place him in a position of high authority or public scrutiny. He deliberately sought out positions that were essential but invisible, roles where he would be integrated into the infrastructure of the local logistics sector without ever becoming a focal point of its culture. As an independent inventory consultant for manufacturing distribution hubs, he became the man who arrived before dawn and left after the last cargo truck was loaded. Reliable fixture who was always polite, always punctual, but never memorable. He didn't make close friends, he didn't join local clubs, and he never allowed his photograph to be taken for company newsletters or community directories. He weaponized the utter banality of his existence, creating a social buffer zone so thick that anyone who tried to look closely at him would see nothing but the flat, uninteresting surface of a career laborer. The digital archaeology conducted by the state's high-technology crime unit after the 2026 arrest revealed the extraordinary length to which the killer went to verify the security of his false front. In the mid-1990s, as the first consumer internet databases began to compile public records into primitive search engines, the suspect didn't hide from the technology. He used it to audit himself. Operating from public terminals in distant libraries to avoid creating a traceable home digital footprint, he would run searches on his own public records, checking to see if his corporate filings or residential deeds had triggered any administrative flags within state law enforcement networks. He was a pioneer of digital risk management, monitoring the slow integration of local, state, and federal systems with the anxious intensity of a day trader watching the market. Every time a new database went online, every time the State Department of Motor Vehicles updated its verification protocols, he would test the system, submitting routine renewals or changing minor account details to ensure that his stolen skin was still holding together. It was a lifestyle built on permanent, low-level paranoia, a daily calculation of exposure that required an immense expenditure of mental energy, a price he paid willingly every single day to keep his freedom from being reclaimed by the ghosts of Oak Ridge. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as we look at the internal records of the county clerk's office, where the historical files of the 1994 task force had been preserved under seal. For 35 years, the case had been a place of quiet, private mourning for a family that believed their daughter's story had been permanently cut short by an administrative failure. They had no idea that while they were leaving flowers at the memorial bench near the fields, just a few miles away, a predator was using the structural gaps in the legal system to secure credit cards, buy property, and collect paychecks. The realization that their family's private tragedy had been used as an administrative cloaking device for a murderer was a secondary violation that nearly destroyed the surviving relatives. When the state police agents first knocked on their door in 2026 to explain the digital validation of the confession, the family didn't understand. They thought it was a cruel joke, a bureaucratic error that was forcing them to exhume a grief they had spent decades trying to put to rest. Back in Oak Ridge, the local library's archive room has become a sanctuary for the few remaining citizens who remember the town before the winter of 1994 set in. The shelves are lined with bound volumes of the old daily newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle, smelling of oil and old ink. When you flip through the issues from that fateful September, you can track the precise moment the town's confidence broke. The headlines shift from local sports and industrial production numbers to frantic appeals for information, photos of search parties wading through the fields near the river, and editorials demanding the immediate resignation of the police chief. The paper trail is a physical manifestation of a collective nervous breakdown, a record of a community trying to make sense of an event that didn't fit into any of their existing models of reality. The older residents sit at the long wooden tables, their hands trembling as they trace the old print, looking for the names of friends who have since passed away, realizing that the confession didn't just solve a crime, it closed the final chapter on an entire era of their history, leaving them as the last witnesses to a tragedy that has finally been transformed from a living memory into a historical artifact. The narrative deepens as we analyze the financial logs of the suspect's final 3 years on Elm Street, an analysis that exposes how the creeping advancement of digital banking infrastructure slowly squeezed the air out of his hiding place. By 2023, the rise of cashless payment systems and the implementation of advanced biometric security protocols at major financial institutions made it nearly impossible for a person to exist without leaving a high-resolution trail of behavioral data. The killer found himself trapped in a world that was systematically eliminating the cash economy he had relied on for survival since the early 1990s. Every time he had to renew his driver's license, every time he had to update his commercial consulting insurance policy, he was forced to interact with systems that utilized facial recognition software and automated database cross-checking. His world was shrinking, the gaps in the network closing up with every software update deployed by the state. He was a man out of time, an analog predator trapped inside a digital net that was growing tighter with every passing second, a reality that explains the frantic nature of his final internet searches as he watched the architecture of his 35-year escape slowly turn into his executioner. The voiceover hits a dawn dap, rhythmic peak as we focus on the transport van carrying the suspect from the high-security medical wing back to the Oak Ridge County Courthouse for the final signing of the custody transfer documents. The highway stretching north is a gray, unyielding ribbon of wet concrete, the rain hammering against the reinforced steel panels of the vehicle with the steady, metallic roar of a factory floor. Inside the cage, the killer sits in complete darkness, his ankles chained to the floorboards, his wrists locked in a heavy leather belt around his waist. He can't see the landscape changing, can't see the suburban cul-de-sacs giving way to the dark pines of the valley and the heavy timber of the north, but he can feel the drop in temperature, the way the cold begins to seep through the floorboards and settle into his old bones. He is retracing the exact route of his operational flights from 1994, but this time, the momentum isn't driven by his own ambition. It is driven by the mechanical certainty of a state that is systematically pulling him back to the scene of his origin, forcing him to face the climate, the town, and the people he spent half a lifetime trying to erase from his mind. The scene shifts to the interior of the Oak Ridge Evidence Room, a subterranean vault beneath the courthouse where the physical fragments of the town's history are preserved under climate-controlled lights. The metal container from the workshop crawlspace sits on a stainless steel table, its surface scratched and dull, surrounded by the original plastic bags containing the evidence collected from the victim's bedroom in 1994. The recovered silver locket lies beside it, its delicate links reflecting the cold fluorescence of the ceiling panels, a small, beautiful, and devastating object that has outlasted everyone's expectations. The contrast between the two collections is a visual representation of the killer's dual existence, the Oak Ridge artifacts representing the sudden, brutal explosion of violence that ended a life, and the workshop artifacts representing the 35 years of silent, disciplined deception that followed. The technician who manages the vault moves with a quiet, reverent precision, logging the items into the digital ledger, ensuring that every piece of the puzzle is tracked with the absolute accuracy that modern jurisprudence demands. The focus shifts to the small, gravel driveway of the bungalow where the victim's sister still lives, a quiet house situated on the edge of the old agricultural zone. The rain has stopped, replaced by a heavy, freezing fog that rolls off the valley river and blankets the streets in a thick, silver silence. She stands on the front porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the occasional car pass by on the wet asphalt. For 35 years, this season was a time of pure dread, a period where the anniversary of the disappearance would drag her back into the raw, bleeding center of her childhood trauma. But this year, the fog doesn't feel like a shroud. It feels like a barrier, a wall that separates her from the violence of the past. She knows the killer is in a cell, knows his real name has been written into the record, and knows the respectable identity has been dismantled by the state. She looks toward the dark outline of the abandoned fields in the distance, realizing that while the town will never be the place it was before 1994, it is finally a place where the truth is the final word, a place where her sister's name can finally be spoken without the automatic, crushing accompaniment of a mystery that had no end. The voiceover carries the weight of this quiet realization into the dark, leaving the listener with the chilling, undeniable understanding that justice is not always a sudden, dramatic victory. Sometimes, it is simply the slow, mechanical exhaustion of a lie. It is the realization that a predator can run for thousands of miles, can change his routine, can live a life of complete and utter respectability, but he cannot change the physical reality of what he did. The truth doesn't care about the passage of time. It doesn't care about the miles traveled or the camouflage constructed. It waits in the code, in the archives, and in the quiet determination of the people who refuse to forget. The cold case of Oak Ridge is no longer an open question, no longer a phantom story designed to frighten children in the dark. It is a monument to the fact that the system, for all its flaws, all its delays, and all its porous boundaries, will eventually, inevitably, find its way back to the start, dragging the ghost out of the sun and into the harsh, unyielding light of the truth. The momentum of the data stream does not slow down. It expands horizontally, forcing the multi-agency task force to confront the historical reality of Arthur Pendleton's administrative career before he established his tenure in Oak Ridge. When the digital units began tracing the physical provenance of the encryption software recovered from his private server, they were pulled back into the late 1970s, an era when Pendleton was completing his graduate work in institutional psychology at a prestigious state university. The records show that his early research wasn't focused on adolescent development or academic counseling. It was a deep, clinical analysis of systemic communication failures within municipal bureaucracies. He was studying the precise ways in which information gets lost, misclassified, or completely ignored as it moves through manual filing systems. The realization hits the modern investigators with a cold, terrifying weight. Pendleton didn't just stumble into the administrative blind spots of law enforcement by accident. He had spent his youth studying the flaws in the architecture of the state, using his academic training to design a criminal methodology that was mathematically optimized to exploit the fragmentation of human record-keeping. This historical context transforms the entire profile of the upcoming trial, shifting the prosecution's focus from a localized cold case into a sweeping, structural evaluation of an institutional predator. The data recovered from his early student files reveals that from 1978 to 1982, Pendleton volunteered as a civilian data analyst for a regional juvenile diversion program, a position that gave him unmonitored access to the master logbooks of missing persons reports, runaway classifications, and juvenile delinquency trends across 4 counties. He was learning how the system categorized human vulnerability, studying the exact phrases and indicators that would cause a local sheriff to write off a disappearance as a domestic issue rather than a potential homicide. He used this insider knowledge to draft his own operational blueprints, ensuring that when he began his campaign in the mid-1980s, every single abduction was meticulously staged to mimic the behavioral patterns of transient runaways, effectively turning the state's own administrative biases into his primary defensive shield. The technical visualization models prepared by the state prosecution team have converted the second floor of the courthouse into an interactive, multi-layered digital theater of war. Analysts have reconstructed a comprehensive, temporal map that integrates Pendleton's academic transcripts, employment history, and professional travelogues into a single, high-resolution timeline that spans 44 years. When the software executes the correlation script, the monitors illuminate with a devastating, multi-state sequence of red clusters. The data shows that the Oak Ridge cases were not the origin of his methodology. They were the refined, localized peak of a criminal trajectory that began in the transient housing complexes and highway rest stops of his university years. The prosecutor's office is preparing a secondary, federal omnibus indictment that treats his entire academic and professional pedigree not as a record of civic achievement, but as a long, systematic training phase for a serial predator who managed to hide his obsession inside the very systems designed to analyze human behavior. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal administrative deconstruction of the state university's psychology department, which has fallen into a state of profound, silent panic. A joint federal audit team has sealed the historical department archives, deploying high-speed scanning systems to convert decades of student records, faculty recommendations, and research papers into a searchable digital database. Investigators are uncovering old, handwritten evaluations from his professors, documents that praised Pendleton as an exceptionally disciplined mind with a rare capacity for objective analytical detachment. The dark, stomach-turning irony is palpable in the quiet university halls. The very traits that made him an academic star, his precision, his emotional distance, his administrative organization, were the psychological components he required to execute a multi-decade campaign of capital murder without ever triggering a single behavioral red flag in the people who evaluated him. Meanwhile, inside the State Forensic Lab's Cybercrimes Division, the extraction teams are parsing the structural data layers of the communication logs found on Pendleton's home server from the late 1990s. The technical data reveals that during the early transition from manual teletype networks to the National Crime Information Center's digital database, Pendleton utilized his credentials as a certified juvenile justice advisor to establish a remote terminal connection from his home study. He was actively logging into the primitive federal data portals, reading internal system design manuals, and tracking the technical limitations of the early algorithmic search tools. He understood that the early databases were dependent on exact text matches, a limitation he weaponized by making sure that the biographical data of his targets, their names, dates of birth, and home counties, were consistently obfuscated or mismatched across regional filings, ensuring that his crimes remained invisible to the primitive, slow-moving digital infrastructure of the late 20th century. The physical exposure of this administrative betrayal has plunged the broader academic and counseling community into a sweeping existential crisis that is redefining the concept of institutional trust. The State Department of Professional Regulation has issued an immediate, emergency mandate ordering the total background exhumation, biometric data verification, and behavioral rescreening of every educational consultant and school counselor who received a state license prior to 2000. The project is an immense, bureaucratic mobilization that has turned the quiet licensing boards of the Capitol into a high-intensity compliance lab, where teams of data specialists are manual cross-referencing thousands of historical application files against the national database of unsolved homicides, realizing with a cold, professional dread that the institutional respectability they used to validate their personnel was the ultimate camouflage for the monsters hiding in their midst. The legal teams managing the defense of the 72-year-old killer are experiencing a total, systemic collapse of their procedural strategy. The traditional defensive tactics of the analog era, delaying the trial until witnesses pass away, challenging the memory of aging relatives, or appealing to the clean character record of a local citizen, are completely useless against a prosecution strategy that relies exclusively on immutable metadata and nuclear-grade forensic imaging. The The defense has attempted to file a series of desperate, high-volume omnibus motions to exclude the university records and early employment data, arguing that the historical files are beyond the statute of limitations for administrative discovery, and that their introduction would create an unconstitutional prejudice in the minds of a jury. But their procedural objections are systematically crumbling against the ironclad chain of continuity established by the state's digital analysts, who have mapped the technical development of Pendleton's methodology with a mathematical precision that leaves absolutely no room for alternative, benign interpretations. The voiceover hits a dawn dap, highly cinematic peak as the dark, stormy summer of 2026 transitions into a freezing, early winter, bringing with it a series of low-pressure fronts that blanket the state capitol in a thick, silver sheet of ice. The heavy sleet rattles against the high windows of the county courthouse, the stone columns of the facade slick and gleaming under the flashing blue and red strobes of the maximum security transport vans waiting in the subterranean security tunnel. Inside his isolation cell, Arthur Pendleton sits in absolute silence, his ankles chained to the floorboards, his frail wrists locked in a heavy leather transport belt that constricts his movement. He is a man who spent 40 years operating as the absolute master of his environment, using his intelligence, his academic credentials, and his flawless social performance to dictate the reality of an entire community. But inside this clinical, technological machine, his complexity has been entirely vaporized. He is no longer the scholar, no longer the counselor, and no longer the phantom of the woods. He is simply inmate number 88419, a biological anomaly being processed by an unblinking digital panopticon that will not stop until his real history is written into the permanent registry of the condemned, leaving the valley town of Oak Ridge to finally, truly, take its first real breath in 40 long, agonizing years. The administrative and historical deconstruction of Arthur Pendleton's dual existence did not merely reshape the modern protocols of the state's judicial system. It initiated an intense, multi-layered forensic investigation into his behavioral patterns during the mid-1980s, a period that the state prosecution team now defines as the operational genesis of his campaign. To understand the Dawn Dap, highly rhythmic progression of this deep history exhumation, one must bypass the current legal updates and look into the technical data logs compiled by the Joint State-Federal Behavioral Mapping Unit. For nearly 40 years, the narrative surrounding the Oak Ridge disappearances focused exclusively on the geographical terrain of the Valley Park, treating the woods as the primary variable in the killer's ability to evade detection. However, the data recovered from his student records and early academic publications from 1983 to 1985 reveals a far more calculated, systemic reality. Pendleton did not select Oak Ridge because he was familiar with the trees. He selected it because his clinical evaluation of rural law enforcement records indicated that the town was an administrative dead zone, entirely unequipped to handle a technical predator who left no physical or digital indicators. The analytical core of this historical phase of the investigation relies on the absolute reconstruction of Pendleton's master's thesis, an unclassified, data-heavy monograph titled The Metrics of Administrative Omission in Rural Law Enforcement Networks, which had sat undisturbed in the university's off-site storage facility since 1984. When the cyberforensics team scanned and digitized the text using high-contrast optical character recognition, they uncovered a comprehensive blueprint for structural evasion. In the thesis, Pendleton utilized advanced statistical models to map the average response times, evidence collection failures, and interdepartmental communication latency of small, non-computerized police departments across the Midwest. He was treating the vulnerability of rural communities not as a social issue, but as a series of predictable, mathematical values. He explicitly calculated how long it took for a localized missing persons report to reach the state police network in the pre-digital era, proving that he had spent his academic career designing a method of operation that turned the system's own structural delays into a permanent alibi. This realization has completely rewired the prosecution's evidentiary strategy for the upcoming trial, shifting the presentation away from a standard forensic match and into a comprehensive exposure of a multi-decade administrative conspiracy. The data analysts have constructed a secondary temporal matrix that tracks Pendleton's confirmed university research trips against a hidden layer of cold case files from the early 1980s that had been written off as historical anomalies. The correlation is an ironclad, mathematical indictment that leaves absolutely no room for procedural suppression. Every time Pendleton requested access to a rural county's manual police archives under the guise of an academic research grant, the local traffic logs and localized missing persons registries in that specific area experienced an immediate, undocumented variance within a 72-hour window. He was utilizing his student credentials as a high-level reconnaissance tool, mapping the technological and structural weaknesses of the communities he intended to target before he ever crossed their borders with an active intent to commit a capital crime. The voiceover takes on a more dap, intense cadence as the narrative transitions to the internal administrative deconstruction of the State University's graduate housing archives, where Pendleton lived during the initial phases of his criminal development. A specialized federal recovery unit has systematically sealed the historical real estate and utility ledgers of the university district, deploying high-speed digitization arrays to convert decades of physical paperwork into searchable metadata fields. Investigators are uncovering a parallel network of cash-only storage unit leases and anonymous post office boxes registered under structural variations of his academic alias, locations that Pendleton maintained without ever logging them on his official university financial aid applications. The dark, stomach-turning irony is palpable in the sterile archive rooms. The very system that was funding his intellectual development was providing him with the financial and logistical anonymity he required to establish his early hunting infrastructure, allowing him to stockpile supplies, map transport corridors, and archive his early research data entirely outside the reach of traditional surveillance. Meanwhile, inside the State Crime Laboratory's high-technology division, the extraction teams are parsing the structural data layers of the microcassette audio recordings recovered from the concrete vault beneath his workshop. The technical data reveals that Pendleton's use of audio recording was not an auxiliary aspect of his obsession. It was an active, data-driven system of behavioral analysis. Utilizing advanced digital audio processing software, the forensic technicians have isolated the background frequencies embedded in the analog tapes, filtering out the voice data to analyze the acoustic signatures of the environments where the recordings were made. The data shows that many of the tapes were not recorded in his official school counseling office, but in his personal vehicle, utilizing high-sensitivity, concealed microphones to capture the unguided, vulnerable conversations of the adolescents he traveled with during state-authorized field trips. He was collecting psychological source material, converting the raw trauma of his students into an empirical database that he used to refine his techniques of human manipulation, turning his professional status into a license to harvest the vulnerabilities of the very community that celebrated him as a local hero.